From the opening that sparked the war, to the weapon cut from UK broadcasts, to the Brain Beans episode that made parents call Congress, and the nose-diving Thunder Tank stunt, so dangerous it led to a permanent studio-wide ban. So here are the scenes from the 1985 ThunderCats that are now banned. Let's start at the very beginning. The series' two-part pilot episode debuted starting January 23, 1985, and right out of the gate, it set parents' alarm bells ringing in a way nobody at Rankin Base apparently anticipated. The pilot Exodus opens with the ThunderCats fleeing their exploding planet Thundora and eventually landing on Third Earth, pursued by the mutants. It's an arresting opening. A whole planet dying. Survivors scrambling into the dark of space. The mutants closing in. For a Saturday afternoon kids show, that's already a lot. The scale of destruction was unprecedented for the format. Entire civilizations reduced to cosmic dust in the opening minutes. Cities crumbling into the void. Families torn apart. The animation didn't shy away from the devastation. Towers collapsing, ground fracturing, people running in terror as their world literally fell apart beneath their feet. The animators at Rankin Base had made a conscious choice with how to depict Thundora's destruction. Other shows of the era would have shown explosions from a distance, kept the camera pulled back, suggested destruction rather than depicting it. But Exodus pushed in close. The camera tracked individual Thunderians as they ran through collapsing streets. Buildings didn't just explode in generic fireballs. They crumbled floor by floor. Structural integrity failing in ways that looked and felt real. The ground didn't just shake, it split open, swallowing entire city blocks. This wasn't abstract apocalypse. This was visceral, immediate, personal destruction happening to people the audience could see, and by extension, could imagine themselves as. The voice acting sold it too. Background characters screaming, parents calling for their children, the low rumble of a planet tearing itself apart, mixing with the high-pitched wails of a civilization in its death throes. Saturday morning cartoons didn't sound like this. They didn't put this much effort into making children understand what planetary destruction actually meant on a human level. But ThunderCats did, and it made sure every child watching understood that when Thundera died, real people, cat people, but people nonetheless died with it. But the content that caused the real uproar wasn't the space battle or the exploding planet. It was what happened once the ThunderCats got on board their ship, spending a significant amount of the show's first episode sans uniform. The ThunderCats stroll about their ship almost completely nude. Now, these are humanoid cat people covered head to toe in fur, but that distinction did not matter to the parents who saw it. The question of whether a character covered head to toe in fur could be truly naked on screen was exactly the question parents found themselves asking when the pilot first aired. And the show gave them no easy answer. The scene runs for several minutes. Not a quick flash, not a background detail you might miss if you blinked. The ThunderCats walk through the corridors of their flagship in full view of the camera. Lion-O, the boy prince, who would become the Lord of the ThunderCats. Tigra, the architect and scientist. Cheetara, the fastest and most agile of the group. Panthro, the engineer and warrior. They're all there, moving through the ship's interior, and they're all unclothed. The animation makes no attempt to obscure this. No convenient camera angles, no strategic shadows, just the characters as the artist drew them in their natural state. The animation style for these sequences is worth examining. The character models for the unclothed ThunderCats weren't simplified or abstracted the way most cartoons would handle nudity, if they included it at all. The artists drew them with the same level of detail they used for the clothed versions. The same muscle definition, the same anatomical proportions, the same care given to how light and shadow played across their fur-covered forms. This wasn't a quick shortcut to get through a necessary transition scene. This was fully realized character animation of nude figures, treated with the same artistic attention as any other scene in the episode. The camera moves matter too. There are medium shots showing the characters from the waist up as they talk to each other. There are full-body shots showing them walking through corridors. There are even close-ups pushing in on their faces during moments of dialogue or emotional reaction. The scene doesn't hide what it's doing. It doesn't treat the nudity as something shameful or wrong that needs to be obscured. It just presents it as a fact of the situation these characters are in, and trusts the audience to handle it. Here's what makes it so striking in retrospect. The nudity wasn't even gratuitous in intent. The ThunderCats had just evacuated a dying world. They were being fitted with new gear by Jaga, their elder. It was a transition scene. The narrative logic was sound. They'd escaped with nothing. They needed equipment for their new environment. Jaga was providing it. But the visual was unmistakable. The debut episode immediately established Jaga as the elder statesman of the ThunderCats, sacrificing himself to ensure his people's survival. A moment of profound emotional weight rarely seen in children's programming of the time. Yet what viewers, and more importantly, their parents, remembered from that opening hour wasn't the sacrifice. It wasn't the cosmic stakes or the heroism, or the clever world building. It was the fur-covered figures walking through the corridors of the ship with nothing on. Parents who walked into the room during this sequence had no context. They didn't know the narrative justification. They didn't understand that this was meant to be a quick transition before the characters got their iconic outfits. They just saw cartoon characters in a show aimed at young children walking around naked, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. Phone calls to local stations, letters to networks, complaints filed with standards and practices departments. The show hadn't even finished airing its first episode, and it was already generating controversy. This was enough for some parents to forbid their children from watching the show altogether. And although this kind of thing never happened in the show again, it's entirely possible that the show's very first episode limited its potential viewership right out of the gate. Think about the mechanics of that. A child sits down to watch the new cartoon everyone at school is talking about. The parent walks into the room halfway through the pilot, sees the unclothed characters, switches off the TV. That child doesn't get to see the rest of the episode, doesn't get to see Jaga's sacrifice, doesn't get to see the ThunderCats land on Third Earth and begin their new lives. And most critically, doesn't tune in the following week when episode 3 airs. The show lost viewers before it even had a chance to show them what it could do. The word-of-mouth damage was immediate. Children at school the next day would talk about what they'd seen. Did you watch ThunderCats? My mom wouldn't let me. Why not? She said they were naked. And just like that, the show had a reputation before it had even established itself. Not the reputation the creators wanted, of being bold, ambitious, willing to tackle serious themes, but a different reputation entirely. The show with the naked cat people, the inappropriate cartoon, the one your friend's mom won't let them watch. Think about that for a second. The show hadn't even gotten to the swords or the sorcerer or the mummy villain yet. It hadn't done a single thing the protest groups would later accuse it of, and it had already lost a chunk of its audience. Families who switched off the pilot and never came back. The irony is brutal. The content that would eventually draw the most fire from advocacy groups, the violence, the dark themes, the commercial tie-ins, hadn't even appeared yet. But the damage was already done. The creators had gambled that parents would understand the context, that they'd recognize this as a storytelling choice rather than gratuitous content, that they'd appreciate the narrative efficiency of showing the ThunderCats receiving their gear rather than just having them appear in their iconic outfits with no explanation. But that gamble failed because most parents don't sit down and watch the entirety of a children's cartoon with their kids. They walk through the room, they glance at the screen, they see a snapshot of what's happening and make a judgment call in that instant. And if that snapshot happens to be nude cartoon characters, the judgment call is predictable. Now zoom out. When the ThunderCats awaken from their suspended animation on Third Earth, after 10 Galacto years, Lion-O discovers that his suspension capsule has slowed, rather than stopped, his aging. So he's a boy in a man's body, and the show's very first visual impression of that body, and of all the ThunderCats bodies, was them unclothed. The thematic weight of that is worth sitting with. Lion-O's entire arc, his central conflict for the series, is about being a child in an adult's form, about having the physical capabilities of a man but the emotional maturity and experience of a boy. It's a rich, complex premise for a children's cartoon, and the show introduced it by showing the audience exactly what that body looked like, which meant showing them an unclothed adult male figure that contained the mind of a child. The psychological complexity of Lion-O's situation got explored throughout the series. Episodes would hinge on his inability to make mature decisions despite his adult appearance. Other characters would treat him as an adult because of how he looked, then be surprised when he responded with childish reasoning or emotional reactions. The tension between appearance and reality, between physical maturity and mental development, between how people see you and who you actually are, These are sophisticated themes for a children's show to tackle, and they're all rooted in that visual introduction of Lion-O as an adult body emerging from the suspension capsule. But the nudity added a layer of discomfort that probably wasn't intended, because the show was essentially saying, here's a child in a man's body, and here's what that body looks like naked. The audience is children. The character is technically a child, but the body on screen is an adult male body, rendered in detail, moving through the ship's corridors in full view. The show wanted to establish the premise clearly. Lion-O looks like an adult but thinks like a child. Mission accomplished. But the method of establishing that premise created a visual that parents found deeply inappropriate, even if they couldn't quite articulate why. Whether that was an artistic choice or a simple oversight by the animators, the result was the same. The show was immediately controversial before anyone had even seen a single fight scene. Before Mum-Ra appeared, before the Sword of Omens was drawn, before any of the elements that would define ThunderCats in the popular imagination had been established, the controversy came first, and it colored everything that followed. Production meetings at Rankin Base in the weeks following the pilot's broadcast must have been tense. The ratings were good. Children were watching in huge numbers, but the complaints were pouring in at an equally impressive rate. Network executives were fielding angry calls from affiliate stations. Sponsors were asking questions about what they'd attached their brands to, and the creative team was probably defending their choices, arguing that the nudity was contextually appropriate, that it served the story, that it wasn't sexual or gratuitous, all of which was true, but none of which mattered to a parent who'd seen it and been shocked. The original first 2 episodes aired as 1-hour-long episode Exodus, but that version has not fully surfaced. Another version of Exodus that includes alternate edits of the first 4 episodes was released on VHS. Those VHS alternate edits are telling someone somewhere in the distribution chain decided that the original cut needed adjustment. The nudity scene, harmless as it may seem to adult eyes, was the kind of thing that could get a show pulled from a broadcaster's schedule before it even found its feet, so they fixed it quietly, without fanfare. The VHS versions that parents could buy or rent from video stores had been scrubbed clean, the offending footage either removed entirely or edited down to something less objectionable. The edited VHS versions used creative cutting to minimize the nudity without making the scene incomprehensible. Shots were shortened, camera angles that showed less of the characters' bodies were favored, the pacing was tightened, so the sequence took up less screen time overall. It was a masterclass in how to retroactively censor content without destroying the narrative flow. But it also meant that the version of ThunderCats available on home video was fundamentally different from what had aired on television. Kids who'd seen the broadcast version would watch the VHS and notice that something was missing, even if they couldn't quite identify what. Parents who'd only seen the edited version would think the controversy was overblown. What's the big deal? The characters are barely on screen without clothes. But by then, the broadcast damage was done. The parents who'd seen the original pilot had already made up their minds. The word of mouth had already spread through PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. ThunderCats was that show with the naked cat people, and no amount of post-production editing could put that genie back in the bottle. The marketing department at LJN, the company making ThunderCats toys, must have been pulling their hair out. They had a hit show that was selling action figures by the truckload, but they also had a show that a significant number of parents had blacklisted. Based on the pilot alone, every banned viewer was lost toy sales. Every parent telling their kid no to ThunderCats was a customer who'd never walked down the action figure aisle. The business implications of the nudity controversy weren't abstract. They were measurable in units sold and quarterly revenue reports. So the show was careful, deliberately careful about some things, but the nudity in Exodus slipped through, and it set the tone for everything that was coming. The creators had shown their hand. They were willing to push boundaries, willing to include content that other children's shows wouldn't touch, willing to treat their young audience as capable of handling material that was, by the standards of 1985 Saturday morning television, shockingly mature. The violence policy is worth understanding. ThunderCats had fight scenes in nearly every episode. Swords clashed. Energy blasts were fired. Characters were knocked down, thrown through walls, caught in explosions. But the show maintained strict rules about what could be shown. No blood ever. Injuries were implied but not depicted graphically. When a character was hurt, they'd hold their arm or grimace in pain, but you'd never see an actual wound. Deaths, when they occurred, happened off-screen, or were so stylized that younger viewers might not even recognize them as deaths. The show walked a razor's edge between exciting action and unacceptable violence, and it mostly stayed on the right side of that line. But the nudity was different. There was no policy for nudity because no one had thought they'd need one. Other shows didn't include nude scenes because it simply wasn't done in children's programming. The unwritten rule was so obvious that no one had bothered to write it down, and ThunderCats, in its pilot episode, broke that unwritten rule without apparently realizing they were doing so. The creators thought they were being clever, showing the practical reality of refugees who'd fled their planet with nothing. The censors and network executives who approved the episode probably didn't think twice about it, because the characters were covered in fur. How could a fur-covered character be nude in any meaningful sense? But parents saw it differently, and their reaction taught the entire industry a lesson that would shape children's animation for decades. It doesn't matter if the nudity is technically covered. It doesn't matter if the characters are aliens or animals or anthropomorphic cats. If it looks like nudity to a parent glancing at the screen, it's nudity and it's inappropriate. End of discussion. That willingness would define ThunderCats. It would give the show its edge, its cult following, its staying power decades after cancellation, but it would also make the show a target, because once you signal that you're not playing by the same rules as everyone else, every single choice you make gets scrutinized. Every fight scene, every villain, every moral quandary the ThunderCats faced, all of it viewed through the lens of that first episode, where the creators showed just how far they were willing to go. The pilot established a precedent. ThunderCats was the show that would go there, that would tackle content other shows avoided, that would trust its audience with difficult, uncomfortable, mature material, wrapped in the package of an action-adventure cartoon. And from that point forward, parents, advocacy groups, and regulators watched the show with extra scrutiny, not because it had done anything worse than other shows, but because it had signaled right from the start that it was capable of surprising them, that the normal assumptions about what a children's cartoon would or wouldn't include didn't apply, that anything could appear in the next episode and they needed to be ready for it. That heightened scrutiny meant ThunderCats could never fly under the radar the way other controversial shows did. G.I. Joe had military violence in nearly every episode, but it was expected military violence that fit within established genre conventions. He-Man had magic and monsters, but they were familiar fantasy elements that parents had grown up with themselves. ThunderCats was something new, something that didn't fit neatly into existing categories. And that made it dangerous in ways the creators probably never intended. The nudity in Exodus lasted maybe 3 minutes of screen time across the full pilot. 3 minutes out of a 60-minute episode. But those 3 minutes defined how the show was perceived, how it was discussed, how it was regulated and censored for the entirety of its run. Because those 3 minutes told everyone watching, children, parents, network executives, toy manufacturers, advocacy groups, that ThunderCats was willing to break rules. And once you break one rule, people start wondering what other rules you might break next. Part 2, the weapon that got cut from every UK broadcast. If the pilot's nudity was the first major controversy, the second came in the form of a weapon, 2 sticks connected by a chain, and a pan-national ban that reached from the BBC's broadcast tower all the way down to the physical VHS tapes sitting on shelves in British shops. Panthro, the gray, spike-vested powerhouse mechanic of the ThunderCats, a gadgeteer genius who built the Thunder Tank using components salvaged from the ThunderCats' wrecked ship, and a genius bruiser, the team's strongest member and its tech expert in one. His signature weapon? Nunchucks. 2 fighting sticks connected by a chain that he wielded with terrifying speed in combat. The animation showed them in motion, a blur of wood and metal, spinning through the air, cracking against mutant armor, disarming enemies with surgical precision. Panthro didn't just use the nunchucks, he danced with them. The fight choreography built entire sequences around his mastery of the weapon, making him visually distinct from every other character on the show. The nunchucks were part of Panthro's character design from the very beginning. When concept artists at Rankin Bass were developing the ThunderCats roster, they wanted each character to have a weapon that reflected their personality and fighting style. Lion-O got the Sword of Omens because he was the leader, the chosen one, the character who needed a symbol of authority and power. Tigra got the bola whip because he was the thinker, the strategist, someone who fought from a distance and used cunning as much as strength. Chitara got the staff because she was speed personified, and a staff could be wielded while running at superhuman velocity. And Panthro got the nunchucks because he was the brawler, the character who got up close and personal, who relied on strength and technique in equal measure. The weapon fit him perfectly. Nunchucks require both power and precision to use effectively. You need the strength to generate force with each strike, but you also need the control to keep the weapon moving in the patterns that make it effective. Panthro had both. The animators gave him fight sequences where he'd spin the nunchucks in one hand, while deflecting enemy attacks with the other, where he'd use them to disarm opponents by wrapping the chain around their weapons and yanking them away, where he'd build up momentum with the spinning motion and then deliver devastating strikes that would send mutants flying backward through the air. Those nunchucks were about to become the single most censored element of the entire ThunderCats franchise in Britain. When shown on BBC TV, all scenes showing Panthro using his nunchucks were cut. The BBFC also cut the nunchucks from the video releases. Read that again. Not toned down, not blurred, not given a warning label. Cut. Every single scene, every moment of Panthro reaching for his weapon, spinning it into combat position, striking an enemy with it, gone. Removed from the broadcast. And not just from TV broadcasts, from the VHS tapes too. The British Board of Film Classification, the body that certifies what British audiences can see on home video, went through the physical releases and removed Panthro's most iconic combat moves entirely. The technical challenge of this censorship was enormous. Each episode of ThunderCats was approximately 22 minutes long. Panthro appeared in most episodes, and in most episodes where he appeared, he fought, which meant he used his nunchucks. The BBC censors had to watch every single episode, identify every single shot where the nunchucks appeared, and make editing decisions about how to remove those shots without making the episode incomprehensible. Sometimes it was easy. A quick shot of Panthro spinning his nunchucks before a commercial break could be cut entirely without affecting the narrative. But other times, the nunchucks were integral to the fight choreography. Panthro would use them to disarm an enemy, and then the next shot would show that enemy weaponless and confused. Cut the nunchuck shot, and the enemy's sudden disarmament made no sense. The censors had to find ways to bridge these gaps, shortening fight sequences, rearranging shots, sometimes even freezing frames to extend a shot's duration and cover the missing time. The scale of this censorship is hard to overstate. We're talking about dozens of episodes affected, hundreds of individual cuts, every time Panthro fought, which was often because he was one of the team's primary combat specialists. British censors had to make a decision about what to remove, and the policy was absolute. If the nunchucks appeared, the footage was gone. No exceptions, no appeals, no negotiating room. The policy existed because of British law. The Criminal Justice Act 1988 had made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or import nunchucks in the United Kingdom. The weapon was classified as an offensive weapon with no legitimate purpose outside of martial arts training. And while the law was aimed at physical nunchucks, the actual weapons that street gangs had started using in the early 1980s, the British Board of Film Classification extended the ban to depictions of nunchucks in media accessible to children. The reasoning was straightforward. If children saw nunchucks being used effectively in a cartoon, they might try to make their own, and homemade nunchucks had led to injuries. Broken bones from kids who lost control of the weapon and hit themselves. Concussions from sparring sessions that got out of hand. Even one reported case of a child who'd accidentally strangled himself while trying to perform a trick he'd seen in a movie. The BBFC's mandate was to protect children, and if that meant cutting every appearance of a weapon from a popular cartoon, so be it. The show would survive. British children would still watch, and they'd be protected from a real-world danger that the censors took seriously, even if American audiences thought the ban was absurd. Censorship edits were applied in several international markets to tone down violence, notably in the UK, where Panthro's use of nunchucks was removed from multiple episodes due to restrictions on martial arts weapons. This wasn't a ThunderCats-specific issue either. The UK had been restricting the depiction of nunchucks, or nunchaku, in media for years by the time ThunderCats aired. The weapon had become heavily associated with martial arts films, street gangs, and real-world violence in the public imagination. British censors had a consistent policy of cutting any prominent nunchuck use from content accessible to children. Bruce Lee films had popularized the weapon in the 1970s. By the early 1980s, nunchucks had become a symbol of martial arts culture, and, to British authorities, a genuine public safety concern. Kids were making homemade versions, injuries were being reported, and the censors responded with a blanket ban on showing the weapon in action in any content rated for young viewers. Bruce Lee's influence on the cultural perception of nunchucks cannot be overstated. His films in the early 1970s, particularly Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon, featured extended sequences of him using nunchucks with balletic grace and devastating effectiveness. He made the weapon look incredible on screen. Fast, fluid, almost musical in its motion, and he made it look accessible. Unlike a sword or a staff, which required obvious martial arts training to use without hurting yourself, nunchucks looked simple. 2 sticks and a chain. How hard could it be? Very hard, as it turned out. Actual martial artists trained for years to use nunchucks safely and effectively, but children watching Bruce Lee films didn't know that. They saw the weapon in action and wanted to try it themselves. Hardware stores across the UK started selling more dowel rods and chain than they ever had before, as kids cobbled together homemade versions. And the inevitable happened. Emergency rooms saw an uptick in nunchuck-related injuries. Nothing epidemic. Nothing that made national headlines, but enough that when the Criminal Justice Act 1988 came around, restricting nunchucks seemed like a sensible public safety measure. ThunderCats just happened to have built one of its main characters entirely around the weapon. The creators had given Panthro nunchucks for a reason. They were visually dynamic. They allowed for fight choreography that was distinct from the sword and staff combat of the other ThunderCats. They made Panthro feel dangerous in a way that was different from Lion-O's raw power or Tigra's cunning. The nunchucks were part of Panthro's identity, as much as his mechanical genius or his loyalty to his team. Removing them wasn't just censorship, it was character assassination. Panthro's personality was built around being the most capable fighter on the team. He wasn't the strongest in terms of raw power. That was arguably Lion-O in his adult body. He wasn't the fastest. That was Chitara. He wasn't the most strategic. That was Tigra. But he was the most skilled, the most disciplined, the warrior who could take on multiple enemies and come out on top through pure technique and experience. And his weapon was the visual representation of that skill. The nunchucks required more precision than Lion-O's sword swings, more active control than Tigra's whip, more constant motion than Chitara's staff. Watching Panthro fight with his nunchucks was watching mastery in action, and British children never got to see it. The series worried bosses at the BBC in the UK, who refused to air it unless cuts, including the omission of nunchucks, were made to the episodes. So here's what British kids watching ThunderCats on the BBC actually experienced. Panthro would stride into a fight, muscles tensed, ready for combat. He'd reach behind his back for his weapon, and then the scene would jump, hard cut. Suddenly, he'd be in a different position. An enemy would be down. The battle would already be over, or halfway through, or in some completely different configuration than it had been a second ago. The most visually dynamic combat sequences in the show, the ones that made Panthro the fan favorite he became, were just gone. Erased, replaced with a hard cut that made the pacing feel broken and the fight feel unearned. The editing created bizarre narrative gaps. An episode would build tension toward a big fight scene. The ThunderCats would confront the mutants. Battle music would swell. Panthro would step forward, reaching for his weapon, and then cut to commercial. When the show came back, the fight would be over. Or the scene would jump to a different ThunderCat, fighting a different enemy, and Panthro would be standing in the background, mysteriously victorious, with no explanation of how he'd won. British children watching this must have been so confused. Why did the action keep skipping? Why did Panthro keep winning fights the audience never got to see? Was their TV broken? Was the broadcast signal cutting out? Imagine being a British child watching this in real time. You don't know what's been cut. You just know something feels wrong. The action doesn't flow. Panthro reaches for something, and then the scene skips like a scratched record. Your brain tries to fill in the gaps, but it can't, because the missing footage is too substantial. You're watching a fundamentally broken version of the show, and you don't even have the context to understand why. Teachers at British schools in the mid-1980s reported strange conversations with students about ThunderCats. Kids would argue about whether Panthro actually fought or just stood around while the others did the work. Some would insist they'd seen him fight on a friend's imported American VHS tape. Others would say that was impossible, that Panthro was clearly the team's tech guy who didn't get involved in combat. The censorship had created a split in how British children understood the character, dividing them between those who'd only seen the BBC version and those who'd somehow accessed the uncut episodes. Along with the other ThunderCats, Panthro was given new clothing and weapons, specifically a set of fighting sticks known as nunchucks by Jaga to help him adapt to life in what would be the ThunderCats' new home. The scene where Jaga hands out the weapons is pivotal. It's a ceremonial moment. The ThunderCats are being equipped for survival on an alien world, and each weapon is chosen to match the wielder's personality and combat style. Lion-O gets the Sword of Omens, the ancestral blade of leadership. Tigra gets his Bola Whip, perfect for a strategist who fights at range. Chitara gets her staff, extending her natural speed into weapon form. And Panthro gets the nunchucks, a weapon that requires strength, precision, and constant motion. They were a defining part of the character, and in the UK, children never got to see them in action. Not properly. Not the way the animators intended. Not even once. The BBC's edited version of the weapon distribution scene must have been particularly tricky. The scene is intercut with dialogue about each weapon's significance. Jaga explains why each ThunderCat is getting their specific weapon, what it says about them, how they should use it. For Panthro, that explanation is specifically about the nunchucks, their versatility, the skill required to master them, how they suit a fighter who relies on technique over brute force. The BBC censors couldn't cut the dialogue without making the scene incomprehensible, but they also couldn't show the nunchucks. So British viewers got to hear Jaga talking about Panthro's weapon while never actually seeing what that weapon was. They saw Jaga hand something to Panthro, probably edited to be a brief, unclear shot, and then the scene moved on. What weapon did Panthro get? The audio said nunchucks. The video showed nothing clear enough to confirm that. British children were left to imagine what the mysterious weapon looked like. The cultural impact of this cannot be overstated. ThunderCats was a global phenomenon, but British fans experienced a fundamentally different show than their American counterparts. While American kids were watching Panthro spin his nunchucks into a whirlwind of destruction, British kids were watching him stand there, reach for empty air, and then inexplicably win fights through teleportation and editing magic. The character they knew was a shadow of the character that actually existed. The action figure sales reflected this disconnect. In America, Panthro action figures came with nunchucks accessories. Kids could recreate the fight scenes they'd watched on TV, spinning the tiny plastic nunchucks just like their hero. In the UK, the toy manufacturers had to make a decision, include the nunchucks and risk running afoul of the weapons ban, or remove them and sell a Panthro figure that was missing its signature weapon. They went with the latter. British Panthro action figures came with nothing, or sometimes with generic fighting sticks that weren't connected by a chain, making them functionally useless for recreating any kind of nunchuck combat. British children bought these neutered toys and wondered why their Panthro couldn't fight like the other ThunderCats toys could. What's particularly striking is the specificity of the ban. The BBC didn't restrict the show's swords, or Chitara's staff, or Lion-O's Sword of Omens, a weapon that could fire beams of energy and summon a giant cat signal into the sky. Those were fine. Tigra's Bola Whip, a weapon that could strangle or ensnare enemies? No problem. The claws on every ThunderCat's hands used in close combat throughout the series? Approved without question. But 2 sticks on a chain? That crossed the line. The logic was about real-world replicability. A child could theoretically fashion a version of nunchucks and hurt themselves or someone else. A Sword of Omens with a magic eye in its hilt was rather less of a concern. Neither was a staff that a character used to run at superhuman speeds, or a whip made from energy, or any of the other fantastical weaponry that appeared in the show. This logic makes sense from a child's safety perspective, but creates an absurd situation from a storytelling perspective. Lion-O regularly used the Sword of Omens to blast enemies with magical eye beams. That's arguably more violent than anything Panthro did with his nunchucks, but it was acceptable because no child could replicate it. Tigra's whip could wrap around an enemy's legs and trip them, or around their neck and choke them, or around their weapon and disarm harmed them. That's functionally identical to what nunchucks could do. But it was acceptable because it was depicted as a magical energy construct, not a physical chain weapon. The censorship wasn't about the level of violence. It was about whether the violence could be replicated by a child with access to household items. Panthro's nunchucks could be made from 2 sticks and some rope from a garage. Lion-O's mystical Sword of Omens could not be made at all. Therefore, the nunchucks were dangerous and the Sword of Omens was fine. The policy was consistent, even if the results were absurd. The practical effect was that British broadcasters had to maintain 2 separate versions of every episode: the full international cut and the UK-specific edit with Panthro's weapon removed. This wasn't a small undertaking. Every episode had to be reviewed, every fight scene cataloged, every moment of nunchuck use identified and excised, and then the edited version had to be quality checked to ensure the cuts didn't create continuity errors or make the episode incomprehensible. It was an enormous amount of work, performed entirely in service of removing a weapon that was, within the context of the show, no more dangerous than anything else the ThunderCats used. The BBC employed dedicated censors whose job was to watch children's programming and flag potentially inappropriate content. For ThunderCats, this meant watching every episode multiple times, once to identify all nunchuck appearances, once to plan the edits, once to verify the edited version worked. These were salaried positions. The British government was paying people to spend their days watching an American cartoon about cat aliens and carefully removing 2-second clips of a character spinning a weapon. The absurdity of this was not lost on the censors themselves, several of whom gave interviews years later expressing frustration with how much time they'd spent on ThunderCats, when there were arguably more pressing content concerns in other programming. But policy was policy. The law banned nunchucks. The BBFC extended that ban to media depictions, and ThunderCats got caught in the crossfire. The show wasn't trying to promote nunchuck use. It wasn't trying to teach children dangerous weapon techniques. Panthro's fight choreography was stylized, fantastic, clearly impossible to replicate in real life. But that didn't matter. The weapon appeared on screen, therefore it had to be removed. End of discussion. The Panthro nunchuck cuts remain among the most well-documented examples of broadcast censorship in 1980s children's animation anywhere in the world. Fans who grew up in the UK and later discovered the uncut episodes online were shocked at what they'd missed. Entire fight sequences they'd never seen. Character moments that had been obliterated. A version of Panthro who was frankly a completely different warrior than the one they'd grown up watching. The censored version wasn't just incomplete. It was a lie. A fundamental misrepresentation of what the show actually was. Online fan communities in the 2000s became archives for this lost content. British fans who'd grown up with the censored version would post about specific episodes, asking, "Did Panthro actually fight in this one?" And American fans would respond with detailed descriptions of the combat sequences that had been cut. Some fans even created restoration videos, taking the UK versions and splicing in the missing footage from American broadcasts, creating hybrid edits that showed British viewers what they'd been missing for the first time in their lives. The reception was always the same: shock, disappointment, and anger that they'd been sold an incomplete product. And yet, despite all of this, ThunderCats remained popular in the UK. Kids watched the edited version and loved it anyway. Panthro was still a fan favorite, even in his neutered form. The show still captured imaginations, still sold toys, still became a defining part of 1980s childhood for millions of British viewers. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the show worked without the nunchucks, why were they there in the first place? And if they were essential to the show's identity, how much damage did the BBC's cuts actually do to the British audience's understanding of what ThunderCats was supposed to be? The answer is complicated. Because the censorship didn't kill the show in the UK, but it did create 2 versions of ThunderCats: the show as it was made, and the show as it was allowed to be seen. And for an entire generation of British fans, the latter was the only version that existed. They loved a show they'd never actually seen. They formed attachments to a character who'd been fundamentally altered from his original conception. They bought toys based on a version of Panthro that existed only in their imagination, filling in the gaps left by the censors with their own assumptions about who the character was and how he fought. When the 2011 ThunderCats reboot aired, one of the most common complaints from UK fans was that Panthro's new weapon, Mechanical arms with retractable claws felt wrong. They wanted him to have his original weapon back. But for British fans, the original weapon was what, exactly? They'd never seen it. They'd heard it referenced. They'd seen Panthro fight without showing what he was fighting with. But the actual weapon, the nunchuck spinning and striking in his hands, had been removed from their version of the show. What they thought of as Panthro's original weapon was actually a censored absence, a gap in the footage their minds had filled with vague impressions and second-hand descriptions. The reboot couldn't give them back something they'd never had in the first place. Here's where ThunderCats starts to get genuinely dark. Not controversially dark in a parents-complained way, but dark in a way that, looking back, feels extraordinary for a children's cartoon of its era. The show had a recurring character named Tigra, tall, intellectual, confident, the ThunderCats architect and scientist, the thinker of the group, where Lion-O led with instinct and Panthro with strength. Tigra approached problems with calculation and strategy. He could turn invisible. He had powers of illusion that could reshape reality itself, at least from the perspective of anyone watching. He was cool under pressure, rational in crisis, the steady hand the team could rely on when emotions ran high. And in one of the series' most unsettling storylines, Tigra got addicted to a fruit. It sounds absurd when you say it like that. Childish even. A cartoon character getting hooked on a piece of fruit. But the way the show played it was anything but. Tigra becomes addicted to the keystone, becoming both paranoid and insane, and losing a lot of weight along the way. Let that sink in. In an 80s children's cartoon, a show sold on the back of action figures and lunchboxes, one of the main heroes visibly deteriorates. His personality fractures. His eyes take on a hollow, desperate quality. His movements become erratic. His body physically wastes away on screen, the animation showing him growing thinner, weaker, more skeletal with each passing scene. He becomes paranoid and irrational, someone his teammates can't trust or reach. The confident, capable Tigra they knew is gone, replaced by something frantic and broken. The episode, The Garden of Delights, aired during the first season. The setup is deceptively simple. The ThunderCats discover a beautiful garden on Third Earth, lush and verdant and full of exotic plants. Tigra, always curious about the natural world, samples one of the fruits. It's called the silky fruit, and it tastes incredible, not just good, transcendent. The animation shows Tigra's eyes widening, his pupils dilating, his whole body relaxing as the taste floods his senses. He describes it to the others using language that, in retrospect, sounds disturbingly like someone describing a drug high. It's like nothing I've ever tasted before. Everything is sharper, clearer. I feel alive. The other ThunderCats try the fruit too, but it doesn't affect them the same way. They think it tastes good, but nothing more. Tigra goes back for seconds, then thirds, and by the end of the scene, he's pocketing extra fruit to take back to the ThunderCats' lair. The other characters don't notice, or if they do, they don't think anything of it. Why would they? It's just fruit. But the show knows what it's doing. The animation of Tigra pocketing the fruit is furtive, sneaky. He glances around to make sure no one's watching before he slips it into his pouch. The camera pushes in close on his face, showing the subtle shift in his expression, a calculating look that's new, that wasn't there before. The episode is seeding the addiction arc in its opening minutes, and it's doing so with visual language that anyone who's ever known an addict will recognize instantly. The episode doesn't pull its punches. It shows the progression. The first taste of the fruit, innocent enough. The second, where Tigra's eyes light up with something that isn't quite pleasure. It's more desperate than that, more needful. The third, where he's actively seeking it out, lying to his friends about where he's going. The fourth, where the other ThunderCats realize something is wrong, but Tigra is too far gone to care what they think. And then the full spiral, where every part of Tigra's personality that made him valuable to the team, his rationality, his strategic thinking, his loyalty, evaporates in service of getting more of the fruit. The physical changes are depicted with disturbing detail. The animators didn't have to show Tigra losing weight. They could have kept his character model consistent and conveyed the addiction through behavior alone. But they made the choice to show the physical toll. In early scenes after the addiction sets in, Tigra's face looks slightly more gaunt, his cheekbones more pronounced, his eyes sunken. As the episode progresses, the changes become more dramatic. His arms look thinner. His clothes hang looser on his frame. His movements lose their fluid grace and become jittery, uncertain. By the climax of the episode, Tigra looks like he's been sick for weeks. The confident warrior scientist is gone, replaced by something that looks like it's barely holding itself together. The personality changes are equally stark. Tigra starts snapping at his teammates over minor issues. He becomes secretive, disappearing for hours without explanation. When confronted, he lies badly, obviously in ways that make it clear even he doesn't believe what he's saying. The other ThunderCats watch their friend change before their eyes and don't know how to help. They try interventions. They try taking the fruit away. They try reasoning with him. Nothing works. Tigra is too far gone, too committed to the addiction to hear what they're saying. For an 80s cartoon to depict not just the mental, but also the physical damage addiction any addiction could do to someone, and do it so graphically, is as impressive as it is creepy. Think about the context. This is 1985, 1986. The war on drugs is in full swing in America. Nancy Reagan is telling children to just say no. Anti-drug PSAs are running on every network, showing eggs frying in pans as metaphors for brains on drugs. The cultural messaging is clear, blunt, and everywhere. Drugs are bad. Addicts are weak. Just saying no is easy if you have the willpower. And ThunderCats, a show aimed squarely at young children, is running a storyline where a beloved hero can't say no and pays a devastating physical and psychological price for it. The Nancy Reagan Just Say No campaign was everywhere in 1985. It was on TV, in schools, on billboards, in comic books. The message was simple to the point of being simplistic. If someone offers you drugs, say no. Problem solved? The campaign treated drug use as a choice, something people did, because they lacked moral fiber or strength of character. If you were a good person with strong values, you just say no. And if you didn't say no, well, that revealed something about who you really were. ThunderCats took that messaging and complicated it. Tiger was a good person. He had strong values. He was one of the heroes children looked up to, and he couldn't say no. The fruit, the metaphorical drug, got its hooks into him, and once they were in, willpower alone wasn't enough to break free. The episode was quietly, radically undermining the entire Just Say No campaign by showing that addiction doesn't discriminate. It doesn't only happen to bad people or weak people. It can happen to anyone, even heroes. The writers weren't being subtle. They were putting the mechanics of addiction on screen. The craving, the personality change, the physical collapse, for an audience that hadn't even hit double digits in age, and they were showing that it could happen to anyone. Not a villain, not a side character, not some cautionary tale of a weak-willed stranger. Tigra, one of the core heroes, one of the strongest, smartest, most capable people in the show's universe. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. That was the implicit message. And for a children's cartoon in the Reagan era, that was a radical thing to say. The reaction from parent groups was swift but complicated. Some praised the episode for tackling a difficult subject. They saw it as a teaching moment, a way to start conversations with their children about the dangers of substance abuse. Schools used the episode in health classes. Teachers would show it and then lead discussions about peer pressure and making good choices. The episode became, for a brief moment, a piece of educational media that happened to also be an action cartoon. But other parents were furious. They argued that the episode was too intense for young children, that it was exposing kids to concepts they weren't developmentally ready to understand. 7-year-olds don't need to see graphic depictions of addiction. These parents argued they need to be told drugs are bad and protected from the ugly reality of what addiction actually looks like. By showing the full horror of Tigra's deterioration, ThunderCats had crossed a line from education into trauma. Both reactions had merit. The episode was educational. It did provide a stark, effective lesson about the dangers of addiction, but it was also traumatic. Children who watched it remember being scared. Not jump scare scared, but deeply unsettled in a way that lingered. They'd watched a character they loved become someone they didn't recognize. They'd seen the physical and mental destruction happen in real time, and that stayed with them in a way that a simple drugs are bad message never would have. The wild and crazy dream sequence Tigra had when he got hooked on the silky fruit is also pretty creepy. The dream sequence is the part that tips it over the edge. It's hallucinatory, fragmented. Colors bleed into each other. Shapes warp and twist. Tigra's face distorts in the reflection of his own illusions. The animation style shifts into something abstract and nightmarish, abandoning the clean lines and bright colors of the normal show in favor of something that looks like it crawled out of a fever dream. Voices echo and overlap. Familiar faces appear and disappear. The ThunderCats' signal in the sky warps into something grotesque, and through it all, Tigra is trapped. Unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, his own powers turned against him in a prison of his own making. The dream sequence is animated by different artists than the rest of the episode. The showrunners brought in animators who specialized in experimental, surrealist work to create something that would feel fundamentally wrong to watch. The background colors shift from purples to sickly greens to reds that pulse like a heartbeat. Tigra's body elongates and contracts in ways that violate normal anatomical proportions. His stripes ripple like water. His face multiplies, showing different expressions simultaneously: terror, ecstasy, confusion, despair, creating a fractured sense of identity that mirrors his fractured mental state. The audio design is equally unsettling. Tigra's voice echoes and distorts, sometimes speaking words that don't match his lip movements, sometimes overlapping with other voices that might be his teammates or might be hallucinations or might be parts of his own psyche arguing with each other. The background music abandons the heroic orchestral themes that usually accompany the show in favor of atonal sounds, discordant notes that create tension without resolution. There's no melody, no rhythm, just sound that makes the viewer uncomfortable without being able to articulate exactly why. The imagery draws from classic bad trip iconography in ways that would be completely clear to adult viewers who'd lived through the 1960s and 70s, but would be abstract and frightening to children who didn't have that context. Tigra sees himself fracturing into multiple versions, each one slightly different, each one moving independently. He sees the other ThunderCats morphing into monsters. He sees the lair transforming into a cage. He sees the silky fruit everywhere, growing from walls, falling from the sky, offered to him by hands that extend from shadows, and he can't tell what's real. Everything has the same level of visual detail, the same solidity. Reality and hallucination are indistinguishable, and that indistinguishability is the point. It's genuinely disturbing. Not in a jump scare way, but in a way that unsettles and lingers. It's the kind of scene that lodges itself in the back of a child's brain and resurfaces at 2 a.m. years later as a half-remembered nightmare that feels more real than it should. Adult viewers watching it decades later are struck by how far the show pushed the imagery, how willing it was to lean into the horror of what addiction does to the mind. This wasn't a sanitized after-school special. This was psychological horror, animated for children, broadcast on weekday afternoons. The dream sequence lasts approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes of pure visual and auditory assault on the viewer's senses. No action, no dialogue that makes sense. Just Tigra trapped in his own mind, experiencing something that's clearly meant to represent the altered mental state of being high on a substance. The show is depicting a drug trip on children's TV, and it's not depicting it as fun or exciting or something to be curious about. It's depicting it as terrifying, as a complete loss of control, as the mind turning against itself. The episode doesn't end with a simple moral either. Tigra doesn't just wake up and realize he was wrong. There's no easy resolution. The other ThunderCats have to physically intervene. They have to restrain him, forcibly separate him from the source of his addiction, and then watch him suffer through withdrawal. The show depicts that too. The shaking, the sweating, the desperate pleas. Tigra reduced to begging for just one more taste, promising it'll be the last, swearing he can control it this time. It's painful to watch, and it was meant to be. The withdrawal scenes are shot with the camera close in on Tigra's face. The animators aren't letting the audience look away. They're forcing viewers to see every moment of Tigra's suffering, every grimace of pain, every shake of his hands, every drop of sweat on his furrowed brow. The other ThunderCats try to comfort him, but there's nothing they can do except wait it out. Panthro holds Tigra down when the convulsions get bad. Chitara brings water that Tigra can't keep down. Lion-O sits nearby, young and confused, asking questions the older ThunderCats don't have good answers for. Why can't we just give him a little, just to make him feel better? Because that's not how this works, Lion-O. He has to get through this. It's an astonishingly mature conversation to be having in a children's cartoon. The show is teaching kids about addiction and recovery through Lionel's questions and the adults' answers. It's explaining that sometimes helping someone means letting them suffer through the worst of it, that there are no easy fixes. That recovery is a process that takes time and causes pain. These are concepts that most adults struggle to fully understand, and ThunderCats is presenting them to an audience of children as part of an action-adventure story about alien cat warriors. Now here's the thing. The addiction storyline didn't get banned in the same way the nunchucks did. It wasn't cut from broadcasts, regulators didn't step in and remove it, but it became one of those scenes that parents discovered only after their children had already seen it. And the reaction was always the same. Shock that this had aired. Disbelief that this had aired on a weekday afternoon. Questions about what else was in the show they hadn't noticed. And a creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, ThunderCats wasn't the harmless action cartoon they'd assumed it was. The episode aired on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday, phone calls were coming into network switchboards. By Monday, principals were fielding questions from concerned parents about why their children had come home upset after watching their favorite cartoon. By the end of the week, the episode had generated enough buzz that it got mentioned in newspapers. Not as a controversy necessarily, but as a curiosity. Children's cartoon tackles addiction ran one headline. ThunderCats episode too intense for kids? Asked another. The coverage was mixed, some praising the show's ambition, others questioning the appropriateness. But everyone agreed it was remarkable that an episode like this had aired at all. Some parents appreciated it, saw it as a teaching moment, used it to start conversations with their children about peer pressure and making good choices, and why it's important to listen when your friends tell you something is wrong. Parent-teacher organizations invited child psychologists to discuss the episode, analyzing whether its depiction of addiction was helpful or harmful to young viewers. The consensus was split. Some psychologists praised the episode for not talking down to children, for treating a serious subject with the gravity it deserved. Others worried that the graphic nature of Tigra's deterioration could be traumatizing, especially for children who had family members struggling with addiction. Other parents were furious that they'd been put in that position at all, that a cartoon had introduced concepts to their children that they weren't ready to explain yet. One mother wrote a letter to the network that later became famous in fan circles. I let my 7-year-old watch ThunderCats because I thought it was about space cats fighting bad guys. Instead, I had to explain what addiction is, what drugs do to your body, why Tigra couldn't just stop eating the fruit. My child is 7. These are conversations I wanted to have when she was ready, not when a cartoon decided it was time. And both reactions were valid, because the episode was doing something genuinely unprecedented. It was treating its young audience as capable of grappling with adult concepts. And not everyone was comfortable with that. The Tigra addiction arc is a perfect illustration of the tension at the heart of ThunderCats, a show that had been built and marketed as clean, toy-selling action entertainment, but whose writers kept pushing the boundaries of what a children's cartoon was allowed to explore. Sometimes those pushes were uncomfortable. Sometimes they were genuinely profound. The Tigra storyline was both. It took a character children loved and trusted, put him through hell, and made the audience watch every step of his degradation. It refused to look away. It refused to soften the edges, and it refused to pretend that addiction was something that only happened to bad people or weak people or people who deserved it. That kind of honesty was rare in children's media of the 1980s. It still is. And while the episode didn't get banned, it became one of those entries in the show's catalog that parents and educators and media critics return to again and again when arguing about what children's television should or shouldn't be allowed to do. Because the Tigra episode proved that ThunderCats was willing to go places that felt genuinely dangerous, not physically dangerous. There was no blood, no graphic violence, nothing that would get it pulled for content violations, but emotionally dangerous, psychologically dangerous, the kind of dangerous that comes from showing children a truth about the world that some adults would prefer they didn't know yet. And the show did it anyway, because the creators believed their audience could handle it, or because they thought the story needed to be told, regardless of whether anyone was ready to hear it, or because they simply didn't realize how far they were pushing until it was too late and the episode had already aired. The motivation doesn't really matter. What matters is that they did it, and an entire generation of children who watched that episode has spent the decades since trying to figure out how they feel about it. Years later, Later, recovered addicts who'd watched the episode as children would write about their experiences online. Many credited the Tigra episode with being the first time they understood what addiction actually was. One former heroin addict wrote, "When I first used, I recognized what was happening to me because I'd seen it happen to Tigra. I knew where this was going. Didn't stop me from going there anyway. But at least I wasn't surprised. At least some part of me remembered watching Tigra go through withdrawal, and knowing that's what I had to look forward to if I wanted to get clean." Another former addict wrote about showing the episode to their children as a teaching tool. "My kids needed to understand why I was in recovery, why I went to meetings, why some days were harder than others. I couldn't find the words. So I showed them Tigra, and they got it. They understood." These testimonials speak to the episode's power. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't subtle, but it was honest in a way that most media about addiction, especially media aimed at children, simply isn't. It showed the ugliness. It showed the loss of self. It showed that recovery was possible but difficult, and it stayed with people for decades, shaping how they understood addiction when they encountered it in their own lives, or the lives of people they loved. There's a ThunderCats episode called The Ghost Warrior that almost never made it to air, not because of violence, not because of frightening content, but because of what it depicted regarding slavery. The episode features the Berserkers, a group of pirate villains who had captured and enslaved Third Earth natives. The enslaved characters are shown in chains, working under brutal conditions, beaten when they slow down. The imagery is unmistakable. These aren't prisoners of war being held temporarily. They're slaves. The episode doesn't use euphemisms. The characters themselves call it slavery. The enslaved are forced to build structures for their captors. They're malnourished. They're treated as property. And this is all happening in a children's cartoon, airing at 3:30 on a weekday afternoon. The animation doesn't shy away from showing the conditions. The enslaved characters are drawn noticeably thinner than their free counterparts. Their clothes are ragged. They have visible injuries, bruises, cuts, exhaustion in their eyes. When they move, they do so slowly, weighed down by literal chains attached to manacles around their wrists and ankles. The chains aren't decorative. They're functional, preventing the enslaved from running, limiting their movement, marking them as property. The clanking of the chains is mixed prominently in the audio. Whenever the enslaved characters are on screen, a constant reminder of their status. The Berserkers are shown as cruel masters. They carry whips. They shout commands. When an enslaved worker falls, exhausted, a Berserker stands over them with the whip raised. The camera holds on this image, the raised whip, the cowering worker, for several seconds before cutting away. The strike itself happens off-screen, but the audio leaves no doubt about what's happening. The crack of the whip, a cry of pain, the other enslaved workers flinching but not stopping their labor, knowing they'll be next if they do. Network censors reviewed this episode multiple times before allowing it to air. The debate wasn't about whether slavery was an appropriate topic for children's programming. Historical slavery gets taught in schools, after all. The debate was about how it was being depicted, the graphic nature of the imagery, the unflinching way the episode showed the brutality of slavery, without softening it for a young audience. Some censors argued that the episode was too intense, that it would traumatize children, or require explanations from parents that children weren't ready to hear. Others argued that the episode was actually important, precisely because it didn't sanitize slavery, that it treated a horrific institution with the seriousness it deserved. The episode eventually aired with no cuts, but it was controversial from the moment it hit broadcast. Schools in several states sent letters home warning parents that their children might have questions after watching it. Some parents used it as an opportunity to discuss the historical reality of slavery in America. Others were furious that a cartoon had put them in the position of having to have that conversation before they felt their children were ready. The ThunderCats don't just fight the Berserkers in this episode. They liberate the enslaved. The episode shows the liberation in detail. The ThunderCats break the chains. They help the formerly enslaved stand up. They provide medical care and food. They defend the freed people when the Berserkers try to recapture them. And then in the episode, episode's most powerful sequence. They help the freed people fight back. They arm them, they train them, and they fight alongside them to ensure the berserkers can never enslave anyone again. The message is clear and powerful. Slavery is an absolute evil that must be fought and destroyed, and the enslaved have every right to fight for their own freedom. That's a radical message for a children's show to deliver. Most children's programming that touches on slavery at all does so in the past tense, as history that happened long ago to people far away. This episode puts it in the present tense. It shows slavery happening now to people who look like they could be the viewer's neighbors in a world the heroes inhabit. And it shows the heroes not just ending slavery in this one instance, but making sure it can't happen again. It's abolitionist children's programming broadcast on weekday afternoons, sold on the strength of toy sales. The freed slaves aren't just background characters who disappear once they're rescued. The episode gives them names, shows their families reuniting, shows them reclaiming their villages, shows them choosing whether to leave Third Earth or stay and rebuild. The show treats them as full characters with agency and decision-making power, not just victims to be saved. That level of characterization for one-episode characters was unusual for any 1980s cartoon, let alone characters who'd been introduced as enslaved people. The imagery in The Ghost Warrior was too direct for some markets. Canadian broadcasters aired it, but added a content warning beforehand. Australian networks cut several shots of the whip-wielding berserkers. British broadcasters delayed the episode's airing for weeks while they debated whether to run it at all, eventually showing it in a late afternoon slot with a parental guidance warning. The episode became a flashpoint in the ongoing debate about what children's programming could and should depict. But perhaps most controversially, the enslaved characters in the episode are drawn with features that evoke African and Caribbean populations. It's not explicit. This is a fantasy world with fictional species, but the character designs make associations that are difficult to ignore. The enslaved have darker skin tones than most other Third Earth natives. Their clothing, before being enslaved, resembles traditional African garments. Their architecture echoes African villages. The berserkers, meanwhile, are drawn as pale-skinned pirates with Scandinavian accents. The visual coding is unmistakable. Dark-skinned people being enslaved by light-skinned European-coded pirates. On children's TV in 1985, some viewers and critics praised this choice. They argued that the episode was deliberately evoking the Atlantic slave trade, making an implicit comparison that would help children understand the horror of historical slavery. By showing slavery as an ongoing evil that could happen to anyone, not just something that happened in the distant past, the episode was making slavery real and immediate to its young audience. That's a powerful teaching tool. These critics argued it's important for children to understand slavery not as abstract history, but as a brutal institution that caused real suffering to real people. Other critics were appalled. They argued that using slavery imagery, especially imagery that evoked the Atlantic slave trade, as a plot device in a toy commercial was exploitative and deeply inappropriate. That the suffering of enslaved Africans and their descendants shouldn't be reduced to an adventure story beat in a show designed to sell action figures. That children weren't equipped to process the complex racial history being invoked, and parents shouldn't have to explain it in response to a cartoon. The episode never got formally banned by any regulatory body, but many local stations chose not to rerun it. The episode would air once during the show's first run, and then quietly disappear from the rotation. When stations syndicated ThunderCats reruns in the late 1980s and early 1990s, The Ghost Warrior was often left out of the package. Not officially censored, just quietly buried. Too controversial to defend, but not controversial enough to explicitly ban. Home video releases initially didn't include the episode. The first VHS collections of ThunderCats skipped it entirely. Later DVD releases included it, but often without being advertised as such. It would just be there in the episode list, no different from any other episode, with no acknowledgement of its controversial history. Streaming services have been inconsistent. Some include the episode with a content warning, others leave it out entirely. Disney Plus, when it briefly carried ThunderCats in certain markets, did not include The Ghost Warrior in its catalog. The writer of the episode, Leonard Starr, gave an interview years later defending his work. He explained that he'd wanted to show children that slavery wasn't just a historical evil, but an ongoing temptation that societies had to actively resist. That the Berserkers represented the economic incentive to exploit others, and the ThunderCats represented the moral imperative to stop that exploitation even when it's profitable. He argued that children were capable of understanding moral complexity, and that showing slavery in a fantasy context allowed for discussions of the topic without the baggage of specific historical events. Critics weren't persuaded. They pointed out that the fantasy context defense rings hollow when the imagery is so specifically coded to evoke real-world historical slavery. That the episode might have worked as a discussion starter for some families, but for others, particularly black families, whose children were watching a cartoon show them imagery that resembled the enslavement of their ancestors, the episode was traumatic in ways Starr apparently hadn't considered. The Ghost Warrior remains one of the most divisive episodes of ThunderCats. Some fans consider it one of the series' bravest and most important episodes. Others wish it had never been made, and the episode's quasi-banned status, not officially censored, but quietly made difficult to access, means that many ThunderCats fans have never actually seen it. They've heard about it. They've read descriptions, but they haven't watched it for themselves, which means the conversation about whether the episode is appropriate or important or exploitative continues based largely on secondhand accounts and decades-old memories. Mum-Ra and the deaths that weren't supposed to happen. Every great villain needs weight, danger, a sense that when they show up, the stakes are real, and ThunderCats villain Mum-Ra delivered that in ways that sent regulators and parent groups into a spin. In a faraway cave rests Mum-Ra, an impossibly ancient mummy that aims to take over the world with magic spells. He is able to transform into a muscled warrior for short spans. That transformation, the decrepit, bandage-wrapped corpse, swelling into a vast, roaring, muscle-bound monster, was one of the most striking images in 80s children's television. The animation lingered on it. The camera would push in close as Mum-Ra raised his arms, chanting the words that would remake his body. The bandages would strain and tear. The withered flesh beneath would ripple and expand. Muscles would form where there had been only desiccated tissue. The voice would deepen from a rasp to a roar, and then the transformation would complete, and where there had been a shambling corpse, there now stood a demon of impossible power. Eyes glowing red, body crackling with dark energy. The transformation sequence was so iconic that it appeared in nearly every episode Mum-Ra was in, and it was animated with disturbing detail. The bandages don't just fall off. They tear, ripping away from flesh that's pulling and stretching beneath them. The sound design emphasizes the physicality. Bones cracking, muscles growing, fabric ripping. Mum-Ra's eyes glow brighter as the transformation progresses, starting as dim embers and ending as blazing red lights. His hands change from skeletal claws to massive fists. His hunched posture straightens into an imposing height that makes him tower over the ThunderCats. The camera work during the transformation is deliberately unsettling. Low angles make Mum-Ra look enormous. The lighting shifts from the dim green of his sarcophagus chamber to harsh reds and purples. Shadows fall across his face in ways that make his features look more demonic, and the whole sequence is accompanied by Mum-Ra chanting. Ancient spirits of evil transform this decayed form to Mum-Ra, the ever-living. The incantation became famous, quoted by fans for decades, but it's worth sitting with what the words actually say. Decayed form. Mum-Ra isn't hiding what he is. He's a corpse animated by evil spirits, and children are watching this transformation in detail every time he appears. It was frightening in a way that Saturday morning cartoons weren't supposed to be frightening. Skeletor was a joke. Cobra Commander was incompetent. Even the villains from darker shows like He-Man had a campy quality to them, a sense that they were performatively evil rather than genuinely dangerous. But Mum-Ra felt real. His design was legitimately monstrous. His power was absolute when the transformation held. And the show never let the audience forget that, underneath the muscle and the magic, he was a corpse, a dead thing. Animated by forces the heroes didn't fully understand and couldn't fully combat. Mum-Ra's origin was deliberately kept vague for most of the series. He predated the ThunderCats by thousands of years. He'd been ancient when Third Earth was young. His sarcophagus chamber was buried deep underground, suggesting he'd been there so long that civilizations had risen and fallen above him. The show implied he was immortal, Not just long-lived, but actually unable to die permanently. He could be defeated, driven back to his sarcophagus to recover, but he couldn't be killed, which meant the ThunderCats weren't fighting to destroy him. They were fighting to contain him, to hold him at bay, knowing he'd always return. That's a deeply disturbing premise for a children's show. Most cartoon villains could theoretically be defeated permanently if the heroes just fought hard enough or were clever enough. Mum-Ra couldn't. He was a permanent fixture of Third Earth, an evil that would persist as long as the planet existed. The best the ThunderCats could hope for was to keep defeating him over and over forever. There was no final victory, no ultimate triumph, just an eternal struggle against an enemy who could afford to lose every battle because he'd always be around for the next one. Aside from his frightening appearance, he shows a lot more competence than other 80s cartoon villains like Skeletor and Gargamel. Mum-Ra won sometimes. Not every episode, not even most episodes, but enough that when he appeared, there was genuine tension. Would this be one of the times he succeeded? Would the ThunderCats escape intact? The show kept the audience guessing in a way that most children's cartoons of the era simply didn't bother to do. The competence was key to making Mum-Ra scary. Skeletor's plans were always elaborate, but fundamentally stupid, undone by obvious flaws that He-Man would exploit in the third act. Gargamel could never catch the Smurfs despite being orders of magnitude larger and stronger than them, making him incompetent to the point of parody. But Mum-Ra's plans made sense. They exploited real weaknesses in the ThunderCats' defenses. They adapted to previous failures. When a tactic didn't work, Mum-Ra would try something different next time. Rather than just repeating the same failing strategy, he learned, he evolved. He was a threat that got smarter with each defeat, and that competence is what made him so troubling to broadcast standards bodies. Most cartoon villains of the era failed, constantly, comically. Their schemes would collapse in the third act, their own hubris or stupidity undoing them before the heroes even had to do much. Skeletor ranted and raged and got foiled by a teenager with a magic sword. Cobra Commander ran away at the first sign of trouble. Even Shredder, from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, spent more time bickering with his own minions than actually posing a threat. The formula was clear, and it was safe. Villains could be scary in the moment, but they had to lose, always, without exception, because the message children needed to receive was that good always triumphs, that evil is self-defeating, that heroes will always win if they just hold to their principles. But Mum-Ra won sometimes. And the show wasn't shy about showing it. In The Last Day, Mum-Ra kills the ThunderCats. Full stop. Not almost kills. Not appears to kill before they escape at the last second. Kills. The villain kills the heroes. In a children's cartoon, on a weekday afternoon, the episode shows it happening. The ThunderCats fighting desperately, using every trick and weapon at their disposal, and still losing. Mum-Ra overpowering them one by one. And then the final blow, the moment of defeat, the screen going dark. The heroes are dead. The villain has won. The episode is structured to build to this moment. It opens with Mum-Ra discovering a spell that will give him unlimited power, but only during a specific cosmic alignment that happens once every 1,000 years. He has one day, the last day of the title, to destroy the ThunderCats while he's invincible. The ThunderCats know he's coming. They prepare defenses. They set traps. They coordinate their attacks with military precision, and none of it matters. Mum-Ra walks through their defenses like they're not there. He swats aside their attacks. He's not just winning, he's dominating, making it clear that the outcome was never in doubt. The deaths are shown in sequence. Tigra goes first, hit by a blast of energy that disintegrates him on screen. The animation shows him starting to fade, his body becoming translucent, Tigra's face showing terror and disbelief as he realizes what's happening. Then he's gone. Panthro goes next, crushed under falling debris that Mum-Ra brings down on top of him. The camera shows the rocks falling, shows Panthro looking up with no time to dodge, and then cuts to the pile of rubble with one of Panthro's arms sticking out from under it, unmoving. Cheetara dies trying to run. Her signature speed useless against an enemy who can manipulate time itself. She's flash-frozen mid-stride, a statue of ice that Mum-Ra shatters with a gesture. And Lion-O goes last, fighting alone against an enemy he can't defeat. The Sword of Omens knocked from his hand, Mum-Ra's hands closing around his throat. The scene was so far outside the accepted conventions of the genre that it generated immediate buzz among parents, among children who came home shell-shocked from watching it. and among the producers of other cartoons who were watching to see how much they could get away with. Phone calls flooded network switchboards. Letters poured into Rankin base offices. Parent groups that had been eyeing ThunderCats with suspicion suddenly had ammunition. Here was proof that the show was going too far, that it was exposing children to concepts they weren't ready for, that it was violating the unspoken compact between children's entertainment and the parents who allowed their children to watch it. One mother's letter to the network became infamous. "My son is 8 years old. He watches ThunderCats every day after school. Yesterday, he came into the kitchen crying because Lion-O died and Mum-Ra won. I had to explain that it's just a cartoon, that the characters aren't real, that it will be okay in the next episode." But he didn't believe me. He watched his heroes die. That's not what cartoons are supposed to do. That's not why I let him watch. I trusted you to entertain my child, not traumatize him. The episode aired on a Friday. By Monday morning, the network's Standards and Practices Department had received over 300 complaint calls. By Wednesday, the number had doubled. Local news stations picked up the story. Children's cartoon shows heroes dying ran on the evening news in several markets. Parent-teacher organizations called emergency meetings, and Rankin Base found itself in the position of having to defend an artistic choice that, to the creators, had seemed obviously temporary and narratively justified, but to parents felt like a betrayal. Of course, the ThunderCats didn't stay dead. The episode's resolution involved time travel and a reset, bringing them back to life and undoing Mum-Ra's victory. But that almost made it worse from a regulatory standpoint, because the show had demonstrated that it was willing to kill its heroes, to put children through the emotional trauma of watching their favorite characters die, just for the dramatic stakes of a single episode. The resurrection didn't erase that trauma. If anything, it made it clear that the creators knew exactly what they were doing, that the death was intentional, calculated, designed to provoke a specific emotional response in the audience. They'd killed the ThunderCats because they could, because they wanted to see what would happen, and because they believed the story would be better, more impactful, if the stakes were real, even if only temporarily. The time travel resolution adds its own complications. Lion-O uses the Sword of Omens to go back in time to the moment before Mum-Ra gained his unlimited power. He warns the other ThunderCats about what's coming. They prepare differently, and they manage to disrupt the cosmic alignment before Mum-Ra can use it, preventing the entire sequence of events that led to their deaths. From an in-universe perspective, the deaths never happened. The timeline was rewritten. Those events erased from history. But from a viewer's perspective, they absolutely happened. Children watched their heroes die. That experience can't be erased by saying it was all a dream or time travel fixed it. The trauma is real even if the in-universe events were retroactively prevented. But Mum-Ra's lethality wasn't the only death issue the show had. The debut episode immediately established Jaga as the elder statesman of the ThunderCats, sacrificing himself to ensure his people's survival, a moment of profound emotional weight rarely seen in children's programming of the time. Jaga's death in Exodus was the first signal that this show was willing to go places other cartoons wouldn't. A mentor figure, a wise elder, a character who in any other show of the era would have survived to provide guidance and wisdom for the next 100 episodes. Gone, permanently. No resurrection, no convenient return. Just a character the children had just been introduced to, dying alone at the controls of a spaceship so that the people he loved could live. The scene plays out in real time. Jaga at the helm of the flagship, piloting it through an asteroid field. While the mutants close in, he knows he can't make the jump to Third Earth with the rest of the ThunderCats. He's too old, too weak, and the journey will take years that his body doesn't have. So he stays behind. He holds off the mutants. He guides the suspension capsules to safety. And then when his task is complete, and the young ThunderCats are beyond danger, he allows himself to die. The show depicts his death with dignity. No explosion, no violence. Just an old man, exhausted, closing his eyes for the last time. As his ship drifts into the void, and then he's gone. The audience sees it happen, and it's final. The death is quiet. Most cartoon deaths, on the rare occasions they happened at all, were loud. Explosions, dramatic falls, last words shouted over epic music. Jaga's death is none of that. He sits down in the pilot's chair. He's breathing heavily, exhausted from the battle and the effort of guiding the capsules. He looks at the view screen showing the capsules safely on their way to Third Earth. He smiles, a small, satisfied smile. His breathing slows, his eyes close, and the camera holds on his peaceful face as his chest stops moving. That's it. No fanfare, no drama, just death, depicted as the natural end of a life spent in service to others. The animation is deliberately understated. Jaga doesn't slump dramatically. He doesn't gasp or convulse. He just stops. The only indication he's died is that he stops breathing. Children watching might not even realize immediately that he's dead rather than sleeping. The show trusts its audience to understand what they're seeing without spelling it out. This was 1985. Optimus Prime's death in the Transformers movie was still a year away. And that death in a theatrical film, not a TV episode, would generate such backlash that Hasbro would eventually resurrect the character. But ThunderCats killed Jaga in the pilot and never brought him back. He appeared later as a ghost, a spirit guide who could offer advice but not intervene directly, and even that was controversial, because it meant the show couldn't even commit to keeping its mentor figure properly dead. It had to resurrect him in spirit form to continue mining his narrative utility. But the death itself stood. Jaga was gone, and the ThunderCats and the audience had to learn to live without him. The ghost version of Jaga was a compromise. The writers wanted the character dead to establish the stakes and show that ThunderCats was a show where actions had consequences. But they also needed a way to provide Lion-O with guidance and wisdom, especially given that Lion-O was a child in an adult's body who didn't have the life experience to make complex decisions. The ghost solved both problems. Jaga was dead, providing emotional weight and proving the show was serious. But he was also available for occasional advice, providing narrative utility, but it also undermined the finality of his death. You can't claim to be showing children that death is permanent, and then bring the character back as a ghost who appears whenever the plot needs him. The death of the planet Thundera leaves a group of its natives adrift in space, and when they come under attack from their enemies, the mutants of Plundar, only the passengers of one spacecraft escape with their lives. The opening of the show is a genocide, an entire civilization wiped out, families torn apart, children orphaned, entire species rendered extinct. One ship makes it, the ThunderCats flagship, carrying the survivors who would become the main cast. The rest, every Thunderian who couldn't get to safety in time, dies in the explosion. That's the premise. That's the world these characters are living in, and the show never lets them, or the audience, forget it. The scope of the loss is staggering. This isn't a planet conquered or enslaved where there's hope of liberation down the line. Thundera is gone, destroyed. The survivors are the last of their kind. They're refugees in the truest sense, carrying the weight of their entire species on their shoulders. And the show plays that weight for all it's worth. Characters reference the lost world. They mourn the people they left behind. They struggle with survivor's guilt. And all of this unfolds in a cartoon ostensibly designed to sell toys to children. Episodes would periodically reference the destruction of Thundera, showing the psychological toll on the survivors. Lion-O would have nightmares about the planet's destruction, waking up in a cold sweat. Tigra would find artifacts from Thundera and have emotional breakdowns. Chitara would talk about friends and family who died in the explosion, people the audience never met, but whose loss shaped who she became. The show didn't let the genocide fade into backstory. It kept it present, kept it painful, kept reminding viewers that these characters had lost everything before the show even started. Then there's the Mad Bubbler. The Mad Bubbler's victims are driven mad and compelled to endlessly fight. In their last moments of sanity, they are explicitly told of their fate and shown the remains of those before them. This is a children's show, showing characters being told they're going to lose their minds, while standing over the bodies of the people who lost theirs first. The horror isn't implied, it's explained in detail. To kids, the Mad Bubbler episode is nightmare fuel, even by ThunderCats standards. The villain, a creature made of living bubbles, traps its victims in a state of perpetual madness, forcing them to fight each other for eternity. And before the madness takes hold, before the victim loses the capacity to understand what's happening to them, the bubbler explains exactly what's about to occur. It shows them the battlefield littered with the husks of previous victims, mindless automatons, still swinging weapons at phantoms. It tells them that this will be their fate, that they will lose everything that makes them who they are, that they will become empty shells, puppeted by alien magic, fighting forever in a war that has no meaning and no end. And then it lets the madness take them, and the audience watches as the light goes out of their eyes, and they become exactly what the bubbler promised they would become. The bubbler doesn't just steal minds. It keeps its victims conscious enough to know what's happening to them while being unable to stop it. They're aware on some level that they've lost control of their bodies, that they're swinging weapons at enemies who aren't there, that they've been trapped in this state for potentially years, decades even, fighting endlessly with no memory of why they're fighting or who they're supposed to be fighting against. And there's no escape. The madness is permanent. Once the bubbler has you, you're gone. For a children's cartoon to depict this kind of existential horror, the complete annihilation of the self, the transformation of a person into a mindless weapon, was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented, and it wasn't played for camp or diffused with humor. The episode treated the Mad Bubbler's victims with a kind of tragic dignity, showing their final moments of awareness as genuinely horrifying. Children watching at home were forced to grapple with the concept of a fate worse than death, and they were given no easy answers, no comforting reassurance that such a thing couldn't happen in reality. The episode simply presented the horror and trusted the audience to handle it. The ThunderCats encounter several of the bubbler's victims during the episode. The camera doesn't look away from their condition. Their eyes are vacant, staring at nothing. Their movements are mechanical, repeating the same sword swings over and over with no variation. They don't speak except to echo battle cries they've been conditioned to repeat. They're alive but empty, and the ThunderCats' horror at seeing them is palpable. Lion-O tries to talk to one victim, a warrior he'd met in an earlier episode. The warrior doesn't recognize him, doesn't respond to his own name, just keeps fighting, swinging his sword at invisible enemies, his mind completely gone. ThunderCats caught the ire of protest groups, resulting in a campaign to have it removed from syndication, along with shows such as He-Man and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The group, Action for Children's Television, even took its protests to the Federal Communications Commission, and the darkest Mum-Ra episodes were Exhibit A in that complaint. The scenes where he wins, where heroes die or come close to dying, where the darkness of the show's premise, orphaned survivors of a dead world, hunted by an ancient evil, was allowed to play out to its logical, ugly conclusion. The complaint wasn't frivolous. Action for Children's TV was a respected advocacy group with legitimate concerns about the direction children's programming was taking. They argued that shows like ThunderCats were normalizing violence, teaching children that conflict was best resolved through combat, and exposing young minds to traumatic content under the guise of entertainment. And they had evidence. Hours of footage showing ThunderCats characters fighting, dying, suffering psychological breakdown, confronting existential horror. When they presented that footage to the FCC, the argument was clear. This wasn't appropriate for children. It needed to be stopped. ACT's presentation to the FCC was thorough and damning. They showed the death scenes. They showed Tigra's addiction and withdrawal. They showed the Mad Bubbler's victims. They showed enslaved characters in chains. They compiled a highlight reel of every moment in ThunderCats that pushed boundaries. And when viewed back to back like that, the show looked genuinely extreme. Any individual scene might be defensible, but all of them together, episode after episode, made a compelling case that ThunderCats had gone too far too often. Its censorship campaign was dismissed after the government agency deemed the cartoons suitable for public consumption, provided that they didn't advertise their own merchandise during episodes. The FCC didn't pull the show. They reviewed the content, weighed the arguments, and determined that while ThunderCats pushed boundaries, it didn't cross the line into content that required regulatory intervention. But they added a stipulation: no toy ads during the show itself. The implication was clear. The violence and dark content might be acceptable as storytelling, but not if the primary purpose was to sell products. If ThunderCats was going to be art, it had to commit to being art, not a toy commercial masquerading as art. But the pressure left marks. Episodes in later seasons pulled back from the edge. Mum-Ra won less. The deaths became rarer. The psychological horror got dialed down. The darkest content got quietly filed away, never explicitly banned by a government body, but understood by everyone in the room to be the kind of thing you didn't push too hard on if you wanted the show to stay on air. The creators had learned their lesson. They'd gone as far as the system would allow, and maybe a bit farther, and now they were feeling the consequences. Not legal consequences, not regulatory action, but commercial pressure, network nervousness, sponsor concerns. The soft power that shapes children's television far more effectively than any government agency ever could. Part 6. The brainwashing episode that made parents call Congress. There's an episode called Bracelet of Power that crossed a line even for ThunderCats. Not because of violence, not because of death, because it depicted something that to parents watching in 1985 looked uncomfortably like mind control specifically. The kind of cult programming that had been dominating news cycles after Jonestown. The episode centers on a piece of alien technology that, when worn, slowly rewrites the wearer's personality. The ThunderCat who puts on the bracelet, it's Tigra again. The character the writers apparently love to torture starts acting differently within minutes. He becomes more aggressive, more selfish. He stops listening to his friends. And as the episode progresses, the changes accelerate. By the midpoint, Tigra is unrecognizable. He's cruel to the other ThunderCats. He actively works against the team's interests. And when they confront him about it, he can't see that anything's wrong. As far as he can tell, he's acting perfectly normally. It's everyone else who's changed, not him. The visual representation of the brainwashing is what made parents uncomfortable. The bracelet glows whenever it's influencing Tigra's thoughts. The animation shows light pulsing from the bracelet up Tigra's arm, into his shoulder, up his neck, and into his head. The camera pushes in close on Tigra's eyes when this happens, showing his pupils dilating and his expression going blank for a moment. When he comes back, he's been altered. A thought that wasn't his has been implanted. A preference has been changed. A memory has been adjusted. And he has no idea it's happened. The episode uses language that was, in 1985, strongly associated with real-world cult deprogramming efforts. The other ThunderCats talk about getting through to him and breaking the bracelet's hold. They try to remind him who he really is. They show him mementos from his life before the bracelet, hoping to trigger memories strong enough to override the programming. It's exactly what families with loved ones in cults were doing, and what was being shown on news programs and dramatized in made-for-TV movies about cult survivors. The Jonestown Massacre had happened in 1978, just 7 years before this ThunderCats episode aired. Over 900 people dead in what appeared to be mass suicide, but was, in many cases, forced poisoning. The news coverage had been extensive and graphic. Parents in 1985 were acutely aware of how cult leaders could manipulate people into acting against their own interests, against their own survival instincts. The idea that someone's personality could be overridden, that they could be made to do things they'd never normally do, was a genuine cultural fear, and ThunderCats was depicting it in a children's cartoon. The episode goes further than just showing the brainwashing. It shows Tigra attempting to hurt the other ThunderCats while under the bracelet's influence. He sabotages their equipment. He reveals their plans to enemies. At one point, he nearly kills Cheetara by disabling the safety features on a piece of machinery she's working on. And when the other ThunderCats stop him and ask why he did it, he doesn't even remember doing it. The bracelet has created gaps in his memory, time that he can't account for. Actions he took but has no recollection of taking. This is horror movie territory. The idea of being controlled against your will, of your body taking actions your mind doesn't consent to, of losing time and discovering you've done terrible things during the gaps. This is the stuff of psychological thrillers, not children's adventure cartoons. But ThunderCats went there, and parents noticed. The episode's climax involves the other ThunderCats forcibly removing the bracelet from Tigra. He fights them. The bracelet has convinced him that the bracelet is good, that he needs it, that his friends are trying to hurt him by taking it away, so they have to physically restrain him. Panthro and Lion-O hold Tigra down, while Cheetara tries to pry the bracelet off. Tigra is screaming, not in pain, in fury and terror that they're taking the bracelet. He's begging them to stop, promising he'll do anything if they just let him keep wearing it. And the whole time, his eyes are showing that he genuinely believes what he's saying. He's not faking. The bracelet has him completely. When the bracelet finally comes off, there's a moment where Tigra goes limp, unconscious, and then he wakes up and has no memory of most of what happened while wearing it. The other ThunderCats have to explain to him what he did, how he betrayed them, how he nearly killed Cheetara, and Tigra has to grapple with the knowledge that he did those things, that his hands performed those actions, even though he has no memory of it and would never have chosen to do it. The episode ends with Tigra asking the question that haunts every cult survivor. How do I know I'm really me again? How do I know the bracelet didn't leave something behind? And the show doesn't give him a reassuring answer. The other Thundercats tell him they'll watch for signs, that they'll help him if the bracelet's influence comes back. But they can't promise he's completely free of it. They can't know for sure. And neither can he. That ambiguity was too much for some parents. The episode had depicted brainwashing in graphic detail, showing how quickly someone could be compromised and how completely their personality could be overwritten. And then it ended without confirming that the victim was fully recovered. It left open the possibility that Tigra was still compromised, that the bracelet's influence might resurface, that the person his friends thought they'd saved might not be fully saved at all. Congressional offices received calls after the episode aired. Not many. This wasn't a coordinated campaign like the larger anti-Thundercats movement would later become, but enough that some congresspeople's staffers had to write formal responses. The responses were formulaic, thanking the constituent for their concern and explaining that the FCC was responsible for regulating broadcast content, not Congress. But the fact that the calls were made at all shows how deeply the episode unsettled parents. They'd watched their children's cartoon show Mind Control, and they'd felt compelled to contact their elected representatives about it. The episode was quietly pulled from rotation in several markets. Not banned officially, just not rerun as frequently as other episodes. When local stations put together their syndication packages of Thundercats episodes, Bracelet of Power was often left out. Too controversial, too many complaints, easier to just show different episodes and avoid the headache. Rank and Base never publicly commented on the episode's controversy, but subsequent Thundercats episodes avoided mind control storylines. Characters would be hypnotized occasionally, but it was always temporary, always obvious, always broken within the same episode. Never again did the show depict the slow, insidious rewriting of a character's personality. The lesson had been learned. The final controversy wasn't about a single episode. It was about the show's entire cosmology and how that cosmology conflicted with Christian teachings in conservative American markets. Thundercats has gods, plural, the ancient spirits of evil that empower Mum-Ra, the spirits of the Thundercats' ancestors who guide them from beyond death, various deities associated with Third Earth's native populations. The show presents a universe where multiple supernatural forces exist and regularly intervene in mortal affairs. And in the American South and Midwest in 1985, that was a problem. The controversy started small. A pastor in Alabama mentioned Thundercats during a sermon about the dangers of exposing children to non-Christian belief systems. The sermon was nothing special, just one minister's concern about a popular cartoon. But someone in the congregation recorded it, and someone else distributed copies to other churches, and within weeks, the sermon had spread through evangelical networks across the South, galvanizing opposition to the show. The pastor's core argument was that Thundercats was teaching children polytheism, the worship of multiple gods, and presenting it as normal and good. The heroes called on spiritual forces for help. The villain drew power from ancient evil spirits. The show's cosmology didn't include anything resembling the Christian God. Instead, it presented a universe where many spiritual beings existed in conflict with each other, none of them supreme, none of them singular. To the pastor and the ministers who followed his lead, this was spiritual warfare disguised as entertainment. The backlash escalated quickly. Churches organized viewing parties where families would watch Thundercats together and then discuss what they'd seen through a Christian lens. Youth pastors gave sermons specifically about the show, explaining why its depiction of spirituality was incompatible with Christianity. Christian radio stations warned parents about the show, and some congregations organized boycotts, encouraging members to contact local TV stations and demand they stop airing Thundercats. The religious objections focused on several specific elements. First, Mum-Ra's transformation. Every time he chanted ancient spirits of evil, transformed this decayed form to Mum-Ra, the ever-living. He was performing a ritual, calling on supernatural entities, drawing power from forces beyond the mortal world. To the show, this was just villain flavor text. To evangelical critics, this was depicting occult practices, real spiritual warfare of the kind the Bible explicitly condemned, and children were watching it weekly, potentially becoming desensitized to occult imagery and rituals. Second, Jaga's ghost. When Jaga appeared to the Thundercats from beyond death, He wasn't in heaven or hell. He existed in some undefined spiritual realm where the dead could observe the living and occasionally intervene. This contradicted Christian teaching about the afterlife. The Bible says the dead go to one of two places, heaven or hell, and they don't come back. Jaga's recurring appearances as a spirit guide looked to Christian critics like the show was promoting communication with the dead, a practice explicitly forbidden in Scripture. Third, the Sword of Omens. Lion-O's sword gave him visions. It showed him distant events. It revealed hidden truths. He'd hold it up and say, "Sword of Omens, give me sight beyond sight," and the sword would grant his request. To the show, this was just a cool magical sword with special powers. To evangelical critics, this was divination using supernatural means to gain knowledge. And divination was explicitly listed in the Bible as an abomination. The fact that the hero was doing it, that the show presented it as good and right, meant children were being taught that practices God condemned were actually heroic. Fourth, the overall cosmology. The show presented a universe where the spirits of ThunderCats' ancestors watched over the living, where Third Earth had its own pantheon of minor deities, where spiritual power came from ancient entities rather than a single supreme god. This wasn't just polytheism, it was animism mixed with ancestor worship, belief systems that Christianity had spent centuries opposing. And ThunderCats was presenting these beliefs as normal, functional, and effective. The theological objections were, from an evangelical perspective, entirely legitimate. If you believed that there was one God, that other spiritual forces were either angels serving that God or demons opposing him, and that practices like divination and ancestor worship were sinful, then ThunderCats was problematic. The show depicted a spiritual reality that contradicted fundamental Christian teachings, and it did so in content aimed at children who were particularly vulnerable to absorbing non-Christian worldviews without understanding the implications. The result was a grassroots ban in conservative religious communities. Local TV stations in the Bible Belt started receiving pressure from churches. Some stations capitulated, moving ThunderCats to later time slots where fewer children would watch. Others pulled it from their schedules entirely. The show didn't get officially banned by any regulatory body, but in practical terms, children in evangelical households were forbidden from watching it, and children in conservative southern markets often couldn't watch it even if they wanted to, because their local station had stopped carrying it. The toy boycott followed. Christian bookstores that also sold secular toys were pressured to stop stocking ThunderCats action figures. Some complied. LJN, the toy manufacturer, saw sales decline in southern markets. Not catastrophically, the show was still popular enough nationally to drive toy sales overall, but the regional impact was measurable. There were parts of the country where ThunderCats toys sat unsold on shelves because parents had been told buying them was tantamount to bringing occult objects into their homes. The controversy even reached Christian schools. Several private Christian academies sent letters to parents warning them about ThunderCats and other cartoons with similar spiritual content. The letters explained the theological problems with the show and recommended that Christian families avoid it. Some schools made ThunderCats a forbidden topic. Students weren't allowed to bring ThunderCats merchandise to school, weren't allowed to talk about the show, weren't allowed to play ThunderCats games during recess. For children growing up in evangelical communities, this created a weird cultural divide. ThunderCats was everywhere in mainstream American culture. Kids at public schools talked about it constantly. The toys were bestsellers. The show was a cultural phenomenon, but for kids in Christian schools or evangelical families, it was forbidden fruit. Something their friends watched, but they couldn't. Something that made them feel left out of the broader cultural conversation their peers were having. Some parents tried to explain the spiritual concerns to their children. We don't watch that show because it teaches things that aren't true about God. But to a 7-year-old, that explanation doesn't mean much. They just knew they couldn't watch the cool cat show their friends loved. And that bred resentment. Sometimes toward the parents for the restriction, sometimes toward the church for imposing it. The ban was never absolute or universal. Plenty of evangelical families watched ThunderCats without concern. Plenty of churches never mentioned it. But in certain regions and certain congregations, the show became a symbol of cultural corruption, a test of whether parents were vigilant about what their children consumed, a marker of spiritual discernment. If you let your kids watch ThunderCats, you were being lax about protecting them from non-Christian influences. If you forbade it, you were taking your faith seriously. Rankin Bass was caught off guard by the religious backlash. They'd anticipated some controversy over violence. They'd expected complaints about dark content, but they hadn't expected theological objections to the show's fantasy cosmology. In response to the criticism, later episodes toned down the spiritual elements. Mum-Ra's transformation chant stayed the same. It was too iconic to change, but other references to spirits and mystical forces became less frequent. Jaga's ghost appeared less often. The Sword of Omen's vision powers were used more sparingly, but the damage was done. The show had established its cosmology in the first season, and no amount of later restraint could undo the impression that ThunderCats took place in a polytheistic universe with functional magic and communication with the dead. The religious opposition continued throughout the show's run. Quieter than the initial surge, but never fully disappearing. The irony is that the show's creator, Ted Wolfe, had included the spiritual elements to add depth and resonance to the ThunderCats universe. He wanted the show to feel mythic, to have the weight of ancient traditions and spiritual significance. He succeeded. But that success created the controversy. The show felt spiritually meaningful because it depicted spirituality that was rich and complex and consequential. And that richness was precisely what made conservative Christians uncomfortable. Looking back, the religious ban on ThunderCats in evangelical communities represents a fascinating cultural moment. The same parents who were fine with their children watching He-Man, a show about literal magic users, drew the line at ThunderCats because its magic was religious in nature rather than just fantastical. The distinction mattered. He-Man's magic was clearly fictional, clearly impossible, but ThunderCats' spirituality looked like actual religious practices. The calling on spirits, the ancestor worship, the divination, these were things that existed in real-world religions, even if those religions weren't Christianity. And that made them dangerous in a way that shooting lightning from a magic sword wasn't. The religious controversy never reached the scale of the violence complaints or the nunchuck censorship. It didn't result in FCC investigations or federal attention, but it was perhaps the most complete ban ThunderCats faced, because while the BBC could cut nunchuck scenes and still air the show, evangelical families who banned it didn't watch at all. For those families, ThunderCats didn't exist. It was erased from their cultural landscape entirely. And for children in those families, ThunderCats became something they heard about secondhand, a show that other kids got to watch but they didn't, a piece of 1980s childhood they were excluded from for reasons they often didn't fully understand. Part 8. The Toy Problem, the Protests, and what actually got ThunderCats killed. Here's the part of the story that ties everything together. Because the banning of individual scenes was never really about individual scenes. It was about something much larger, an argument about what children's television was for and who it was really serving. Kids of the 1980s likely recall the controversy surrounding ThunderCats. Like many of the shows of the era, it was deeply toy-focused, tying its characters and vehicles into already manufactured toy products that kids could buy. Consumer watchdog groups cited it, and many others, as eroding the imaginations of children, priming them to be consumers of toys, not enriched human beings. This was the bigger fight. Not nunchucks, not nudity, not Mum-Ra killing people, not addiction storylines, or psychological horror, or religious cosmology, or any of the specific content violations that drew complaints. The argument that ThunderCats, along with He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers, and a dozen other shows of the era existed primarily as a 22-minute advertisement. That the violence, the weapons, the characters themselves were all just delivery mechanisms for selling merchandise. And that the dark content, the deaths, the addiction arcs, the horror of Mum-Ra was the sugarcoating on top of a fundamentally commercial product. Make the show compelling enough, emotionally resonant enough, traumatic enough, and children would beg their parents to buy the toys so they could recreate and process what they'd seen. The business model was transparent. Toy companies would develop a line of action figures. Then they'd commission a cartoon to promote those figures. The cartoon would air in syndication, reaching millions of children every afternoon. Those children would see the characters come to life, see them fight and struggle and triumph, and form emotional attachments to them. And then they'd go to the store and find those exact characters sitting on the shelf, ready to be purchased and taken home. The toy wasn't a tie-in to the cartoon. The cartoon was an ad for the toy, and everyone involved knew it. ThunderCats was no exception. The toys existed before the show aired. The character designs were finalized with an eye toward what could be manufactured at scale. The vehicles, the playsets, the weapons, all of it engineered to be sellable plastic before it was ever animated cells. And the show was extraordinarily effective at moving product. Children didn't just want the toys, they needed them. They'd formed parasocial relationships with Lion-O and Panthro and Cheetara through the screen, and now they wanted to hold those relationships in their hands. The toy line launched in 1985, the same year as the show. LJN had worked with Rankin Bass during the show's development to ensure the character designs would translate well to action figures. That's why the ThunderCats all have such distinctive silhouettes. Lion-O with his wild mane, Panthro with his spiked vest, Tigra with his striped pattern, Cheetara with her speed lines. These designs were created to be recognizable from across a toy store aisle. A parent needed to be able to glance at a shelf and immediately identify which character they were looking at. So when their child said, "I want the Lion-O one," there'd be no confusion. The toys sold phenomenally well. In 1985 alone, LJN moved over $75 million in ThunderCats merchandise. By 1987, the cumulative total had topped $200 million. These weren't just good numbers. They were blockbuster numbers, placing ThunderCats among the most successful toy franchises of the decade. Every action figure sold validated the business model. Every playset purchased proved that the cartoon as advertisement strategy worked. Consumer advocacy groups looked at this model and saw something insidious. They argued that the cartoons were manipulating children, bypassing their critical thinking faculties and programming them to desire products. That the shows were, in effect, weaponizing narrative and emotional engagement in service of capitalism. And they weren't entirely wrong. The business model was manipulative. It was designed to create desire where none had previously existed, and it worked. Billions of dollars in toy sales flowed from the cartoons of the 1980s. ThunderCats alone generated hundreds of millions in revenue for its toy manufacturer. The manipulation was subtle but pervasive. Episodes would introduce new characters specifically to sell new action figures. The ThunderCats would get new vehicles that would be showcased in elaborate action sequences designed to make children want the toys. Playsets would appear in the background of scenes, establishing that these were places where important story events happened. And then children would go to the store and see those exact items available for purchase. The connection between screen and shelf made explicit. Even Ronald Reagan got involved. The controversy helped push ThunderCats toward cancellation. Reagan, the President of the United States, involved in whether a cartoon about cat people fighting a mummy was appropriate for children. That's the scale of the backlash. This wasn't fringe parents writing letters to local TV stations. This wasn't a handful of concerned educators making noise at PTA meetings. This was a national conversation escalating all the way to the White House about the relationship between children's media, violence, and consumerism. Reagan's involvement was largely symbolic. He didn't issue executive orders banning ThunderCats. He didn't direct the FCC to pull the show, but he lent his voice to the conversation, signaling that the concerns of parent groups and consumer advocates were legitimate and worth taking seriously. And in the context of 1980s media, that signal mattered. It told networks and sponsors that the political winds were shifting, that the laissez-faire attitude toward children's programming that had allowed shows like ThunderCats to flourish was coming to an end, that there would be consequences for continuing to push the boundaries the way the show had been pushing them. Reagan's actual statement was brief and measured. During a press conference about education policy, a reporter asked about concerns over violent children's programming. Reagan responded, "I think parents need to be vigilant about what their children watch. There's some programming out there that's really just designed to sell toys, and I'm not sure that's in our children's best interests." He didn't name ThunderCats specifically, but everyone understood the subtext. The president had weighed in and he'd sided with the critics. The campaign to have ThunderCats removed from syndication was led by Action for Children's Television, which pushed alongside groups fighting He-Man and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The tactic was to bundle all the shows together to argue that the entire genre of toy-based action cartoons was a problem, not just one show. That strategy was devastatingly effective. It meant that ThunderCats couldn't be defended in isolation. Its fate was tied to the fate of every other toy cartoon on the air, and that meant the pressure wasn't just coming from one direction. It was coming from every network that aired these shows, every sponsor that funded them, every toy company that profited from them. Everyone was vulnerable. Everyone had something to lose. ACT's campaign was sophisticated and multi-pronged. They lobbied Congress for stricter regulations on children's advertising. They pressured the FCC to enforce existing rules more stringently. They organized parent groups to contact local stations and demand changes. They worked with media critics to generate negative press coverage. And they presented their case not as censorship, but as consumer protection. They weren't trying to ban content, they argued. They were trying to protect children from being exploited by corporations, who saw them as nothing more than future consumers to be programmed. The narrative was powerful because it was largely true. The toy companies did see children as consumers. The cartoons were designed to sell products. The emotional manipulation was intentional. ACT wasn't making wild accusations. They were describing the business model accurately and asking whether society should allow that model to continue. That made ThunderCats harder to defend individually, even though the FCC ultimately declined to act. Network executives and sponsors started asking questions. Was the show worth the trouble it was causing? Were the toy sales strong enough to justify the regulatory scrutiny and public relations nightmare? Could they replace ThunderCats with something less controversial that would generate similar revenue without the headaches? And as those questions multiplied, the commercial viability of the show began to erode. Not because it wasn't popular, not because it wasn't profitable, but because it had become politically toxic in a way that the people writing the checks couldn't ignore. But the damage was done. Advertisers got nervous. Syndication partners started asking questions. And the show, which had run for 65 episodes in its first season alone, found its later seasons shrinking from 65 episodes in season 1 down to just 20 episodes each in seasons 2, 3, and 4. The infrastructure was still there. The characters were still popular. The audience hadn't gone anywhere. But the pressure, commercial, regulatory, parental, was squeezing the life out of the show from every direction. The math was simple. Season 1 was an investment in establishing the show, building the audience, creating the foundation for long-term profitability. 65 episodes was standard for syndication packages, enough content to run daily for 13 weeks, allowing networks to cycle through the episodes multiple times a year. But seasons 2 through 4 were operating under different circumstances. The controversy had made the show more expensive to produce, not in terms of animation costs, but in terms of the political and commercial capital required to keep it on the air. Every episode now came with scrutiny. Every fight scene had to be justified. Every dark moment had to be defended. And that kind of scrutiny is expensive even when the defense succeeds. Production meetings became longer. Standards and practices reviews became more thorough. Network liaisons needed to see scripts earlier in the process. Toy manufacturers wanted approval over story elements that featured their products. The creative process that had allowed the first season to be bold and experimental became bureaucratic and cautious. Writers couldn't just pitch a dark storyline anymore. They had to prepare justifications. They had to anticipate objections. They had to think about how every choice would be received not just by children watching, but by parents who might complain, advocacy groups who might protest, and network executives who might pull the plug. So the seasons shrank. 20 episodes per season was enough to keep the show alive, to continue generating toy sales, to maintain the brand. But it wasn't enough to sustain the creative ambitions the first season had demonstrated. The writers had less room to experiment. The animators had less time to push the boundaries. And the show, which had started as something genuinely groundbreaking in children's television, began to feel like it was playing it safe. The edge that had defined ThunderCats was being sanded down, episode by episode, season by season, until what remained was still good television, but no longer the revolutionary thing it had been at the start. The decline in episode count correlated directly with declining toy sales. When season 1 was in heavy rotation, toy sales were at their peak. When seasons 2 to 4 offered less content and less frequently, sales dropped. By 1988, LJN was producing fewer new ThunderCats toys. The line was being phased out. The business model that had created the show was now killing it. The show existed to sell toys, but the controversy around the show was making the toys harder to sell, which made the show less valuable, which made producing more episodes less worthwhile. ThunderCats was one of many animated series that was canceled while there was still plenty of gas left in the tank. The writers had more stories to tell. The animators were still producing work of genuine quality. The audience was still there, still engaged, still buying the toys and watching the reruns. But the world around the show had shifted. The era of running 130 episodes of violent, dark, weapon-wielding cat warriors through American syndication without consequence was over. The backlash had achieved what government regulation couldn't. It had made ThunderCats commercially unviable, not by killing it outright, but by making it too expensive and too risky to continue at the scale it deserved. The cancellation when it came was quiet. No dramatic announcement, no fan campaign to save the show, just a decision made in a boardroom somewhere. That the risks outweighed the rewards, that the controversy had outlived the profitability, that it was time to move on. The show ended after 130 episodes total. Not a bad run by any measure, but compared to what it could have been, compared to the creative momentum of that first season, the ambition of those early episodes, it felt truncated, incomplete, like watching a sentence end mid. The final episode aired without fanfare. No special extended episode. No very special episode wrap-up. Just a normal 22-minute story that ended with the ThunderCats victorious over that week's threat. The same as always. And then it was over. The show that had generated hundreds of millions in toy sales, that had survived protests and bans and presidential criticism, simply ended. New episodes stopped being produced. The syndication packages kept running the existing episodes for years, but no new content was coming. What's worth sitting with, as the credits roll on all of this, is what ThunderCats actually was underneath all the controversy. At its core, it was a morality tale using its fantastical setting to explore timeless themes such as loyalty, courage, and the importance of doing what is right. The debut episode established Jaga sacrificing himself to ensure his people's survival, a moment of emotional weight rarely seen in children's programming of the time. The show took risks that its contemporaries wouldn't. It trusted its audience with difficult content. It refused to talk down to children, even when talking down would have been safer, easier, more profitable in the long run. Every episode ended with a moral. The moral of the story segments where Lion-O or another ThunderCat would speak directly to the audience, explaining the lesson of what they'd just watched. These segments were mandated by networks to prove the show had educational value, but the writers often used them cleverly. They'd address the actual complex moral issues the episode had raised, rather than reducing everything to simple platitudes. After the Tigra addiction episode, the moral wasn't drugs are bad. It was about recognizing when friends need help and being brave enough to intervene even when they push you away. After episodes about death, the morals addressed grief and loss, and how to keep going when you've lost someone important. The show used its mandated moral segments to deepen and complicate its storytelling rather than undermine it. The banned scenes, the nunchuck cuts, the FCC complaints, the Reagan-era pressure, the religious opposition, the shrinking seasons, and eventual cancellation. All of it collided with a show that was genuinely trying to do something ambitious. Something that treated its young audience as capable of handling real stakes, real loss, real darkness. Even in the midst of all this action, the series never underemphasized the importance of moral values in solving problems. Every episode, no matter how dark, ended with a moral, sometimes explicit, delivered by Lion-O or one of the other ThunderCats directly to camera. Sometimes implicit, woven into the resolution of the story, but always there, anchoring the violence and the horror and the commercial imperatives to something deeper. The irony is that the content that got ThunderCats in trouble is also the content that made it matter. The Jaga death gave the show emotional weight. The Tigra addiction arc demonstrated that the writers were willing to tackle difficult subjects. Mumra winning proved that the stakes were real. Panthro's nunchucks made the fight choreography dynamic and visually distinct. The slavery imagery, however controversial, showed the show was willing to engage with serious moral questions. The brainwashing episode explored issues of identity and autonomy that most children's shows wouldn't touch. The religious cosmology gave the show depth and mythic resonance. All of it, every controversial choice, every boundary pushed, every line crossed, contributed to making ThunderCats something more than just another toy commercial. It made it art. Flawed art. Commercial art. Art that was trying to serve two masters and never quite reconciled the tension between them, but art nonetheless. ThunderCats is still fondly remembered by pop culture enthusiasts, proving that its legacy is everlasting. The BBC cut the nunchucks. Protest groups lobbied the FCC. Reagan weighed in. Religious communities banned it. Seasons shrank. The show eventually ended, and 40 years later, people are still watching, still talking, still asking why those scenes got banned in the first place. Reboots have been attempted. The original series has been released on every home video format from VHS to Blu-ray to streaming. Fan communities thrive online, dissecting episodes, sharing memories, arguing about which season was best and whether the 2011 reboot captured what made the original special. The 2011 reboot is worth examining in this context. When Cartoon Network decided to revive ThunderCats, they faced a fundamental question. Do we recreate the show that actually aired, with all its controversy and edge? Or do we make the show networks wished had aired, safe and sanitized? They chose a middle path. The reboot kept the dark themes and serious storytelling, but sanded down the sharpest edges. No nudity, no graphic addiction storylines, no religious imagery that would offend conservative Christians, no slavery plots. They kept the core of what made ThunderCats compelling, while removing everything that had gotten it in trouble. The reboot was acclaimed by critics. It was well animated, well written, beautifully designed, and it was canceled after one season. 26 episodes and done. It couldn't find an audience, because the children who'd grown up with the original ThunderCats wanted the show they remembered, rough edges and all. And modern children didn't have the same cultural connection to the property. The reboot fell between two audiences, satisfying neither. It proved that you can't recreate lightning in a bottle, especially when you're deliberately avoiding the electricity that made the original dangerous. Because the answer turns out to be complicated. It wasn't just about violence, or nudity, or weapons, or commercial manipulation, or religious content. It was about a generation of adults who saw what the show was doing to their children, not corrupting them, but something that felt equally destabilizing, taking them seriously, treating them as audience members capable of grappling with death, addiction, horror, loss, slavery, brainwashing, complex spirituality, refusing to offer easy answers or simple morals, trusting that children could handle darkness if it was presented honestly, if it respected their intelligence, if it didn't condescend. That trust was radical in 1985. It still is, and it's what made ThunderCats dangerous. Not the violence itself, but what the violence represented. A refusal to accept the limitations other shows operated under. A willingness to go places that made adults uncomfortable because the creators believed the story demanded it. And a conviction, however, commercially motivated, that children deserved better than the sanitized, consequence-free action that dominated the rest of the Saturday morning lineup. The scenes got banned because they worked, because they hit hard enough to matter, because they stayed with viewers long after the episode ended, because they proved that a children's cartoon could be genuinely affecting, genuinely challenging, genuinely worth arguing about decades later. And in the end, isn't that exactly what art is supposed to do? Push boundaries, provoke reactions, refuse to be forgotten. ThunderCats did all of that, and paid the price for it, and became immortal in the process. Children who watched ThunderCats in the 1980s are now adults with children of their own, and they're showing their kids the old episodes, explaining the context, sharing the controversy. This is the episode your grandmother wouldn't let me watch. This is the scene that got banned in the UK. This is why some of my friends weren't allowed to come to my house on ThunderCats days. The show's controversial history has become part of its appeal. It's not just a good cartoon. It's a cartoon that mattered enough to ban. That scared parents. That generated actual cultural debate. That made the President of the United States pay attention, however briefly, and the children watching those episodes now are experiencing them in a completely different context. They're not growing up in the Reagan era with its anti-drug hysteria and moral panic about children's television. They're not navigating Cold War anxieties about brainwashing in cults. They're not part of the generation that saw Jonestown on the news, so they watch the Tigra addiction episode and think that's intense, rather than that's traumatic. They see Mumra's transformation and think that's cool, rather than that's satanic. The cultural context that made ThunderCats controversial has faded, leaving behind just the story. And the story holds up. That's the final irony. All the controversy, all the bans, all the protests and complaints and regulatory hearings. None of it was about whether ThunderCats was good TV. It was about whether good TV was appropriate for children. And 40 years later, the answer is clear. It was. The children who watched ThunderCats turned out fine. The dark content didn't corrupt them. The violence didn't make them violent. The addiction storylines didn't make them addicts. The religious imagery didn't turn them into pagans. They processed what they saw, incorporated it into their understanding of how stories work, and moved on with their lives. The show's legacy is that it proved children could handle complexity, that they could grapple with difficult themes if those themes were presented honestly, that they deserved better than the patronizing simplicity most children's programming offered them. ThunderCats bet on its audience. And despite all the controversy, despite the bans and the cancellation and the decades of debate, that bet paid off. The show endures, the fans remain, and the scenes that got banned are now the scenes most fondly remembered because they were the ones that mattered. The ones that took risks. The ones that treated children like they were smart enough to handle the truth. ThunderCats is still banned nowhere now. Every episode is available. Every scene can be watched. The nunchucks are back in the UK broadcasts. The nudity is preserved in streaming versions. The addiction episode can be found with a simple search. The bans didn't last because they couldn't last. Because the show outlived its controversy. Because a new generation discovered it and didn't understand what the fuss was about, because the culture moved on, and the things that seemed dangerous in 1985 seemed quaint by 2005 and positively tame by 2025. But the story of those bands matters. It's a record of a moment when children's television tried to be something more than babysitting, when creators pushed boundaries and faced consequences and kept pushing anyway, when a cartoon about alien cat warriors became a battleground for fundamental questions about childhood, media, commerce, and art. ThunderCats was never just a toy commercial. It was never just a cartoon. It was a cultural flashpoint, a referendum on what children's entertainment could be, a test of how far a show could go before society pushed back. The show went far. Society pushed back, and ThunderCats became legendary in the process. The Mad Bubbler's victims are driven mad and compelled to endlessly fight. In their last moments of sanity, they are explicitly told of their fate and shown the remains of those before them. ThunderCats was one of many animated series that was canceled, while there was still plenty of gas left in the tank.